Okay, so this happened a while back now, but honestly, it still messes with me when I think about it too much. We live just outside Pine Woods, right? Pretty quiet place usually, everyone knows everyone else, that kind of small town vibe. But for a while there, things felt off. You know that feeling when the air just feels different, kinda heavy? Like something's about to happen, but you can't put your finger on what. Yeah, that was Pine Woods for a while. People were whispering, not outright saying anything, but you could hear it in their voices, see it in the way they'd look over their shoulder. It was like this unspoken thing was hanging over us all. My dad and his friend, Mr. Henderson, everyone just calls him Hendo, they own a small construction company together. They were hired by this new development group to clear out a plot of land. It was supposed to be easy money, nothing crazy. Just knocking down some trees, clearing brush, you know, the usual. But this plot, this one was different. It was right on the edge of town, bordering this patch of woods that everyone kinda just avoids. Not the main Pine Woods forest, but this sort of extension of it near the swampy area. Nobody really goes there unless they're hunting or something, and even then, they keep to the edges. It just has this vibe. Anyway, Dad and Hendo, along with me and my buddy Mark, we were the crew on this project. First few days were fine, just hot, sweaty work. But then weird stuff started happening. Small things at first. Tools going missing, then turning up in places they definitely weren't left. Equipment acting up for no reason. We brushed it off, figured it was just the usual site annoyances, you know? But then it started to feel deliberate. One evening, it must have been a Tuesday, I think. Yeah, Tuesday, because the game was on, and I was rushing to get home. Dad and Hendo were packing up the truck. Mark and I were gathering the last of the tools. Dad was already behind the wheel, waiting for us. We were running late. Sunlight was starting to fade, that dusky time of evening when shadows get long and everything looks different. Mark and I loaded up the last shovel, slammed the tailgate shut, and hopped into the cab. Dad put it in drive and started to pull out onto the access road we'd carved through the woods. And that's when it happened. There was this almighty crack, like thunder, but way too close and way too solid. It was this bone-jarring thud, followed by the sickening sound of something heavy hitting metal. Dad slammed on the brakes, truck screeched, and we all lurched forward. For a second, everything was silent, except for the ticking of the engine and our own ragged breathing. "What the hell was that?" Dad said, voice tight. He put the truck in park and killed the engine. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crickets starting up in the woods. We got out, adrenaline pumping. We figured maybe a tree branch had fallen or some debris from the site. We started walking around the truck, flashlights clicking on, cutting through the growing darkness. Headlights were still on, aimed down the access road, and there it was, right smack in the middle of the road, maybe 10 feet in front of the truck, was this tree trunk. Not a branch, not some puny piece of wood. This was a full-on birch trunk, thick as my thigh, maybe 8 feet long. It was just lying there, pale and stark against the dirt road, like someone had just placed it there. Except, no one had been there. We hadn't seen or heard a thing until it hit. We were all just staring at it, blinking in disbelief. "A branch?" Mark said finally, but it was more a question than a statement. Dad shook his head slowly. "That's no branch, Mark. That's a whole damn trunk." We shone our flashlights around, searching the trees on either side of the road. Birch trees were all over the place here, that pale, papery bark standing out even in the dim light. But nothing. No snapped branches, no signs of a tree falling, nothing that could explain this trunk just appearing. Hendo walked closer to the trunk, circling it slowly, his flashlight beam dancing over the bark. He bent down, examining the road surface around it. "Look at this," he said, his voice low and puzzled. He pointed to the ground. There were scrapes and gouges in the dirt, like something had been dragged across it, and fresh dirt, like dirt that had just been dug up. We all crouched down, shining our lights, and that's when we saw it. Just off the side of the road, maybe 10 feet into the woods, there was a small patch of freshly turned earth, like someone had dug a shallow hole and then tossed the dirt aside. "What the?" I muttered, feeling a cold prickle on my skin. This was starting to feel seriously weird. Dad was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed. He straightened up and pointed his flashlight deeper into the woods, towards the swampy area. "Anything over there?" We all shone our lights into the trees. Darkness just swallowed the beams a few feet in, just shadows and rustling leaves, nothing else. "Probably just some kids messing around," Mark said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Maybe they dragged it out here as a prank." "Prank?" Hendo snorted. "With a tree trunk this size and dragging it through the woods in the dark? Nah, Mark, this ain't no prank." Dad walked over to the trunk and tried to lift it. Grunting with effort, he managed to get one end off the ground, but it was heavy, awkward. "Solid birch," he said, letting it drop back to the road with a thump. "This thing weighs a ton. No kids are just dragging this around for a joke." We stood there for a few minutes, just staring at the trunk, our flashlights cutting cones in the darkness. The crickets chirped louder, and the wind picked up a bit, whispering through the leaves. It was getting colder, and that uneasy feeling was growing, settling in my stomach like a stone. Finally, Dad sighed. "All right," he said. "We ain't gonna figure it out tonight. Let's just get this thing off the road and get home. We can deal with it in the morning." We wrestled the trunk off to the side of the road, pushing and shoving, our hands getting scraped by the rough bark. It was heavy, awkward as hell to move. Finally, we managed to heave it into the ditch at the side of the road. Then we piled back into the truck, not saying much, just this heavy silence hanging between us. Driving home, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, watching the road behind us shrink into the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves sounded too loud. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next morning, we were back at the site early, sunlight thankfully washing away some of the weirdness from the night before. But as soon as we pulled up, that feeling came back, a cold knot in my gut. We got out of the truck and walked over to where we'd left the trunk, and that's when we saw it. It wasn't just the trunk anymore. Lying right next to the trunk, in the middle of the ditch, was a rock. Not just any rock. This thing was massive. Grey granite, roundish, maybe 2 feet across. It looked like it weighed even more than the tree trunk. And just like the trunk, it looked like it had just appeared. "No freaking way," Mark whispered, staring at the rock. Hendo walked over and kicked it gently with his work boot. "Solid as a mountain," he muttered. "Where the hell did this come from?" We looked around again, searched the woods, the ditch, everything. No sign of where this rock could have come from. No quarry nearby, no exposed rock face, nothing that could explain it. And just like the trunk, no tracks leading to it, no signs of anyone moving it. It was just there. Beside the trunk we'd moved the night before. "This is messed up," I said finally. The prank idea was completely gone now. This was way beyond anything like that. Dad, who'd been quiet, just shaking his head, finally spoke up. "Okay," he said, his voice serious. "Something ain't right here. We need to talk to my dad. My grandpa, see, he's old school. Grew up around here. Knows all the local stories, the legends, everything. He's usually pretty skeptical about most things. Calls anything weird nonsense. But he also knows this land better than anyone. If something weird is going on around Pinewoods, Grandpa usually knows about it, or at least has heard the rumors. So, we called him up, explained what happened with the trunk and the rock. At first he just chuckled, said we were probably seeing things, working too hard in the sun. But then Dad told him about the turned-up earth, the lack of any explanation, and I could hear it in Grandpa's voice change. That chuckle faded, replaced by this quiet seriousness. You said it was near the swampy area? He asked. Dad confirmed it was. Grandpa said, just a low hum in the phone. All right, he said after a moment. I'll come take a look tonight. That evening, Grandpa showed up at the site, driving his old pickup. He got out, looking around with this serious expression, his eyes sharp and taking everything in. He's not a big man, but he carries himself solid, like he's seen things, knows things. You just don't argue with him. We showed him the trunk and the rock, explained about finding them, about moving the trunk the night before. Grandpa listened without saying a word, just nodding slowly. He walked around, examining the ground, the trees, just like Hendo had done. He even walked over to the patch of turned earth and poked at it with his cane. Finally, he straightened up, his eyes looking past us, out towards the woods, towards the swamp. The sun was setting, casting long shadows, and the air was starting to get that same cool, uneasy feeling from the night before. You said, eyes? Grandpa asked, turning to Dad, his voice low. Last night, you thought you saw eyes? Dad nodded, hesitant. Yeah, he said, when we were moving the trunk. I thought I saw something out in the woods, but it was dark, I wasn't sure. Grandpa was silent for a long moment. He pulled out his old flashlight from his truck, this big, heavy thing, way more powerful than our work lights. All right, he said, clicking it on. Let's take a look. My heart started to pound. I didn't want to go back into those woods, not after what had happened, but I wasn't going to say no to Grandpa. Dad and Hendo looked nervous too, but we all nodded. Grandpa started walking, pushing into the woods, his flashlight beam cutting through the deepening twilight. We followed him, stepping over fallen branches, our boots crunching on leaves. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. We went deeper than we had the night before, following Grandpa as he led us further into the trees, heading towards the swampy area. The trees got thicker, the undergrowth denser. It was getting properly dark now, the only light from Grandpa's flashlight and the weak beams of our work lights. And then we reached the edge of the swamp. The ground turned soft and spongy underfoot, the air thick with the musty smell of stagnant water. Grandpa stopped at the edge, his flashlight sweeping across the dark water, the tangled weeds, the shadowy trees on the far side. Shine your lights over there, he said, pointing deeper into the swamp. We all pointed our flashlights in the direction he indicated. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of dark water, clumps of reeds and gnarled trees standing knee-deep in the swamp. And then we saw them, eyes, just like Dad had described, two eyes reflecting back the flashlight beams, burning bright in the darkness. But these weren't animal eyes. These were different. They were huge, for one thing, way too big for any deer or fox or anything we'd ever seen around here. And they were high, way up off the ground, like head height. If it was an animal, it would have to be standing on its hind legs, and even then, it would have to be huge. But it wasn't just the size or the height, it was the way they glowed. They weren't just reflecting light back. They were glowing from within. This eerie, unnatural yellow light, burning bright in the darkness. And they were watching us, staring right at us. We could feel it, this presence, this intelligence behind those eyes. It wasn't an animal looking at us. It was something else. A wave of cold dread washed over me, a primal fear that went right to my bones. I've never felt anything like it. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to run, to turn, and just get the hell out of there. But I was frozen, paralyzed by fear, by those eyes burning in the darkness. Then, slowly, deliberately, the eyes started to move. Not blinking, not shifting from side to side. They started to move, upwards, rising slowly, steadily, higher and higher above the swamp. It was like whatever they were attached to was standing up, rising up out of the darkness of the swamp. And as they rose, we started to see shape. Just a vague outline at first, a darker patch against the already dark background of the swamp. But as the eyes kept rising, the shape became clearer, taller, much taller than any man, taller than the trees. It was a figure, tall, dark, and shapeless. Not like it didn't have a shape, but like the shape was wrong, indefinite. It shifted and wavered in the darkness like heat haze, but solid, massive, menacing. And then it moved, not towards us, but deeper into the swamp. It turned away from us, this huge, dark figure, and started to wade into the water, moving silently, effortlessly through the reeds and the mud. The eyes, those burning yellow eyes, turned with it, still fixed on us for a moment, and then they were gone, vanished into the darkness of the swamp. The silence that followed was deafening. Just the rustle of the wind in the trees, the croaking of frogs in the distance. But that presence, that feeling of being watched, of being afraid, it was still there, lingering in the air, heavy and cold. Grandpa slowly lowered his flashlight, his face pale in the dim light. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just stood there, staring out into the swamp, his jaw tight, his eyes scared. I'd never seen Grandpa scared before. Finally, he turned to us, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. Let's go, he said, and he turned and started walking back the way we'd come, fast, almost stumbling over the uneven ground. We followed him, stumbling, scrambling, just wanting to get out of those woods, to get away from that swamp, from those eyes. We didn't say a word, not until we were back at the trucks, parked on the access road, bathed in the blessedly normal light of the headlights. Even then, no one spoke for a while. We just stood there, breathing hard, looking back at the woods, at the dark line of trees at the edge of the swamp. Finally, Dad said, his voice shaky, What was that?" Grandpa just shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he said, his voice still rough. I don't know." He looked up at the sky, the stars starting to appear, pale and distant. "But," he said, his voice gaining a little strength, "we're not going back there. Not to that plot. We're done with that job." And that was it. We packed up our gear, loaded it into the trucks, and drove away. We never went back to that land. The development group hired someone else to clear it, I guess. We didn't ask, didn't want to know. We never talked about it much after that. It was like we all just agreed to pretend it didn't happen, to bury it deep down and not think about it anymore. But sometimes late at night when it's quiet, I still see those eyes, burning yellow in the darkness, and I still feel that cold dread, that primal fear creeping back into my bones. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't want to know. And honestly, I hope I never see it again. Story 2. Okay, so, where do I even start with this? It still messes with my head, even after all these years. It was back in '90. Fall was really coming on strong, you know, that damp, foggy kind of fall in Michigan, where the woods smell like wet leaves and earth. I'd been hunting since I was a kid with my old man, so I wasn't some greenhorn out there tripping over roots. Whispering Creek, that's where I always went. Had my favorite tree stand tucked back in there near the creek bend. Good spot, usually saw deer traffic through there. This day was different. Real thick fog hanging low, making everything muffled and quiet, spooky quiet even for the woods. Sun was barely poking through, just a weak pale glow up there somewhere. I got up in my stand before dawn, like always. Settled in, thermos of coffee, rifle across my lap, just waiting for the woods to wake up. Normally you hear stuff pretty quick, squirrels chattering, birds calling out, the rustle of leaves when a deer is moving. But this morning, nothing. Dead quiet. It was so quiet it started to get to me, that kind of quiet that makes the hairs on your neck prickle, you know. Felt like everything was holding its breath. I must have been up there a couple of hours just scanning the woods, sipping my coffee, when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Movement over by that patch of tangled trees and underbrush, down near the creek bank. Thought it was a deer at first, just the way something shifted in the shadows. But it wasn't right. Too small, too low to the ground. And the color, off. Deer are brown, obviously. This was muted, kind of grayish-green, like faded moss or something. I brought my rifle up slowly, scope on that spot. Heart started to thump a little harder, adrenaline starting to kick in. Not like deer adrenaline, though. This was different, more like unease, like something was off, way off. Whatever it was moving again, slowly, and then I saw it clearly, or as clearly as the fog would let me. It wasn't a deer, not even close. It was a creature, and I don't use that word lightly. I've seen coyotes, bobcats, bears out in those woods. This was none of those. This was something else. It was small, maybe 5 feet tall, tops. Walking upright, kind of hunched over, but definitely 2 legs. Covered in fur, but not like any animal fur I'd ever seen. It was thick, matted looking, and yeah, that weird grayish-green color, like it had been rolling around in dirt and moss. And it was emitting a smell. I could smell it even up in my stand, probably 15 feet off the ground. Not a stink exactly, and not like anything rotting or dead, more like earthy, but also something else, something almost chemical, hard to describe. Not pleasant, not awful, just wrong, unnatural. I kept my rifle aimed, safety off, finger on the trigger, but I didn't fire. Something stopped me. It wasn't aggression coming off this thing. It was curiosity. I know it sounds crazy, aiming a rifle at something you can't identify and feeling curious. But that's what it was. And fear. Big-time fear, but mixed with this weird curiosity. The creature kept moving, slow and deliberate, through the trees, and then it stopped. Stopped right behind a thick oak, just peeking out from behind it. Like it was playing hide-and-seek. I swear to God, that's what it looked like a kid playing peekaboo. And then it leaned out a little more, and I saw its face. That's when my heart really started to hammer in my chest. Its face, it wasn't human, obviously, but it was familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. Think chimpanzee, but stranger. Its face was flat, almost no nose bridge, big, dark eyes, wide set apart. And its lips, they were thin, more like a chimp than a human, and they curved up. It was smiling. This thing was smiling at me. Not a snarl, not a grimace, a smile. A playful, almost mischievous smile, like it knew I was up there watching it, and it was enjoying the game. It held my gaze, those dark eyes locked onto mine, no fear in them, just intense curiosity. And that smile, man, that smile, it messed with me. It wasn't a friendly smile, not like a human smile. It was unsettlingly knowing, like it knew something I didn't, something important, and it was amused by my ignorance. And then it made a sound, a low sound from its chest, a rumble, a growl, but not aggressive, more guttural, deep, resonant, not like an animal growl, not like a dog or a bear, deeper, more primal. It vibrated through the quiet of the woods, through the fog, right into my bones. I'd never heard anything like it before, and I haven't since. It made that sound a couple of times, this low, rumbling grunt, looking right at me, still smiling that weird, unsettling smile. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. It just turned, moved quickly behind the tree, and vanished. No crashing through the underbrush, no snapping branches, just gone, like it had melted into the fog and the shadows. I stayed in that stand for a long time after that. Gun still in my hands, but now shaking a little, just staring at the spot where it had been, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. What the hell was that thing? My mind was racing, trying to categorize it, trying to fit it into something I knew, something I understood. Animal? Some kind of deformed creature? A hallucination? My mind kept bouncing off those ideas, none of them fitting quite right. It wasn't an animal I knew, and I know animals, woods animals. I'd grown up in these woods. I'd hunted and trapped and hiked in these woods my whole life. Never seen or heard of anything like that. Deformed? Maybe. But the way it moved, the way it looked at me, the intelligence in those eyes, it didn't feel deformed. It felt intentional, purposeful. Hallucination. Maybe the fog, the quiet, the early morning, the coffee on an empty stomach. Maybe. But the smell. I smelled it. That weird, chemical, earthy smell. Hallucinations don't have smells, do they? And the sound, that guttural rumble. I heard it, clear as day, felt it even. I stayed in the stand until well past noon, just sitting there thinking, replaying it in my head over and over. The grey-green fur, the small size, the way it moved, the smell, the smile, the eyes, that sound. Every detail burned into my memory. I didn't see any deer that day. Didn't even care about deer anymore. My hunt was over the moment I saw that thing. Something else had been hunted that day. Me. Not hunted for food, but observed. Studied, maybe. Something had watched me, assessed me, and then just left. I finally climbed down from the stand, my legs stiff and shaky. Walked over to the spot where I'd seen it. Nothing. No tracks in the leaves, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been there. Just damp leaves and tangled underbrush and the lingering smell of wet earth and pine needles. The weird smell was gone. I walked back to my truck in a daze. Everything felt different. The woods, the fog, the silence. It all had a different weight to it now, like something had shifted in the balance of things. Like the world wasn't quite as solid and predictable as I'd always thought it was. I never told anyone about it for a long time. Who would believe me? Crazy old hunter in the woods sees a goblin. Yeah, right. People would think I was nuts, or drunk, or just making it up. So I kept it to myself, just rolled it around in my head, trying to figure it out, trying to explain it. But I can't. I still can't. Years have gone by, decades even, and I still see that face, those dark eyes, that unsettling smile every time I close my eyes in the woods. I still hear that low, guttural sound in my dreams, and I still smell that strange, earthy chemical smell sometimes, out of nowhere, and it sends a shiver right down my spine. I've read stuff online, forums like this, people sharing weird stories, cryptids, unexplained encounters, stuff like that. And sometimes I read something that kind of resonates. Something about small forest creatures, hidden in the deep woods, things people glimpse out of the corner of their eye, things that don't fit into the normal animal world. And I wonder, was that what I saw? Was it something like that? Something unknown? I don't know. I'll never know. And that's the thing that gets to me the most. Not the fear, not even the strangeness of it. It's the unknowing. The fact that I saw something, experienced something that just doesn't have an explanation, something that exists outside of everything I thought I knew about the world. That feeling of the world being just a little bit wider and a whole lot stranger than I ever imagined. And sometimes, when I'm back in the woods, especially in the fog, especially by Whispering Creek, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, smiling, waiting. And that's a feeling that, well, it sticks with you. It really sticks with you, and it never really goes away. It just is. I went back to Whispering Creek a few times after that hunting. But it wasn't the same. I wasn't the same. I was always looking, always listening for something else, for that grey-green flash in the shadows, for that low, guttural rumble, and every time the fog rolled in thick, my heart would start to beat a little faster, not with excitement, but with a different kind of thrill, a thrill laced with fear, and a deep, unsettling curiosity. I haven't been back to Whispering Creek in years now. Too many memories, I guess. Too much uncertainty. But sometimes, late at night when everything's quiet, I think about that day, I think about that creature, and I wonder, what was it? What is it? And was it really just playing? And that smile will haunt me forever. Story 3. Okay, so I'm still not completely okay, you know? It happened years ago, but stuff like that sticks with you, I guess. I was working double shifts back then at the mill in Marquette. Real backbreaker kind of work, you know? Hauling lumber, running the saws sometimes, whatever they needed. November in '02 was brutal, cold as hell, already snowing on and off, and just dark. Always dark. Seemed like the sun went down for good in October and didn't bother coming back until spring. This particular night, man, I remember it clear as day. Like I said, double shift. 12 hours on my feet, mostly outside in the cold air. By the time I punched out, I was beat. Just wanted to get home, shower, and crash. I lived up in Cascade Hills back then, a little cabin place my grandpa left me. Nice and quiet, way out of town, which was usually perfect. But that night, quiet felt different. Anyway, I hopped in my old Ford pickup, the one with the dodgy heater. Started her up, let her warm for a minute, important in that cold, and headed out. The mill was right off 41, and to get home I usually took Forest Road 550, quicker than going around. Now 5 and 50, if you know it, you know it's woodsy, real woodsy, especially past Sugarloaf. Trees on both sides practically touching overhead, road twisting and turning, no streetlights. Pitch black dark on a night like that. I was tired, sure, but not sleepy tired, you know. Just worn out. Windows down a crack even though it was freezing because the truck smelled a little like old motor oil and stale coffee. Radio on low, some classic rock station out of the Sioux, barely coming in. Just trying to stay awake, keep my eyes on the road and get home. I was coming up to that bend right before Sugarloaf Rock. You know, the really tight one that kind of juts out over the lake? Pitch black, except for my headlights cutting through the trees. The snow was holding off for the moment, thank God, but you could feel it in the air, that biting kind of cold that promised more snow later. Ground was already frozen solid. I could feel the bumps in the road through the seat of my truck, and that's when I saw it, just a flicker at first, on the edge of the headlight beam. Something moved in the trees on the right side of the road. Deer, I thought. Happens all the time out there. Gotta watch out for deer, especially at night. I slowed down a little just in case. Then it stepped out of the trees. It wasn't a deer. It was bigger. Way bigger than any deer. At first, my brain just couldn't process it. Headlights hit it full on, and for a split second I was blinded. But even in that flash, I saw color. This reddish-brown, like fire almost in the dark. It was fur, I think, thick and matted looking, covered whatever it was from head to toe. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeched on the asphalt, even though I wasn't going that fast. The truck skidded a little, pulled to the right. I wrestled the wheel, got it back under control. Heart was pounding already, even before I really saw what it was. And then it was in front of me, crossing the road. It was upright, like a person, but not like a person, way too tall. I'm 6 foot, maybe a bit more with my boots, and this thing towered over my truck. I mean, really towered. 7 feet easy, maybe closer to 8. Its arms were long, too, hung down past its knees, or where its knees should be. It moved fast, not running exactly, more like gliding. Smooth and fast, like it wasn't even trying. Each step it took ate up ground. The color, that reddish-brown fur, it was all over. Head, body, arms, legs, everything. I couldn't see its face. Head was kind of hunched down, tucked into its shoulders. But I could see the shape. Roughly human shape, but all wrong. Too long, too thin, but still massive. Like something stretched and distorted. It got to the guardrail on the other side of the road, the one right before the drop down to the lake, and without even slowing down, it just hopped. Not jumped, hopped. Like it was nothing. Like the guardrail was a puddle, just up and over and gone, vanished into the trees on the other side. I sat there in the truck, engine idling, headlights still shining into the empty road, heart hammering in my chest so hard I thought it would bust through my ribs. Breathing was coming in ragged gasps. I could feel the cold sweat popping out on my forehead, even though it was freezing in the truck. What the hell was that? That was the only thing going through my head, over and over. What the hell was that? Deer? No way. Bear? No bear walks like that. No bear is that tall. No bear is that wrong-looking. Man? Come on. No man dresses up in a full-body fur suit and wanders around in the woods at night. And no man moves like that. That speed, that lightness. It was like it wasn't even solid, like it was made of shadow and fur and just wrongness. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I wanted to put the truck in drive and just go, get the hell out of there. But I was frozen, stuck. My brain just couldn't compute what I'd just seen. It was like my senses were lying to me, like I'd imagined it, hallucinated the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. I knew I had seen something real, something alive, out there in the woods. Finally, after what felt like forever but was probably only a few minutes, I forced myself to move. Put the truck in drive, slowly, carefully, drove forward, past the spot where it had crossed, didn't stop, didn't even really look, just kept my eyes glued to the road, hands white-knuckled on the wheel, drove all the way home in a daze. Everything felt different. The dark woods lining the road, they seemed to close in around me. Every shadow looked like it might be moving, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. I jumped. I was on edge, wired tight, terrified. Got to my cabin, pulled into the driveway, killed the engine. Sat there for a minute just listening. Silence, except for the wind rustling in the pines and the faint sound of the lake, waves lapping on the shore. Normally, I liked those sounds. They were peaceful. That night, they just made me feel more alone, more vulnerable. I practically ran to the front door, fumbled with the keys, got inside, and slammed the door shut behind me, bolted it, locked the deadbolt. Felt stupid even as I did it, like a wooden door and a couple of locks would stop. That flipped on every light in the cabin. Kitchen, living room, bedroom, even the porch light out front. Wanted to burn back the darkness. Wanted to make the night go away. I went straight to the bedroom, grabbed the old shotgun from under the bed. It was my grandpa's. Hadn't fired it in years, probably, but just holding it made me feel a little bit safer. Maybe. Not really. Sat up all night in the living room, shotgun across my lap, staring out the front window into the darkness. Every sound made me jump, every shadow made me flinch. I kept expecting to see it. That reddish-brown shape, moving in the trees, watching me, didn't sleep a wink. Just sat there, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins until the first hint of dawn started to lighten the eastern sky. Even then, I didn't relax. Not really. Just felt less terrified, maybe. More exhausted than anything. When it was light enough to see properly, I went outside, cautiously, gun still in hand. Walked around the cabin, checking. Nothing. No footprints in the frozen ground except mine. No broken branches. No sign of anything unusual. Felt stupid again. Like I'd overreacted. Like it had all been in my head. Maybe I was just more tired than I thought. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. Went back inside, made myself some coffee, strong and black. Tried to eat something, but my stomach was in knots. Just paced around the cabin, jittery and wired, thinking about what I'd seen, trying to make sense of it, trying to tell myself it was something normal, something explainable. But I couldn't. Went back out later that morning, drove back to the spot on 550. Broad daylight now, the bend before Sugarloaf. Pulled over, parked on the shoulder, got out, walked back to where I'd seen it cross. Guardrail was just a guardrail, road was just road. Woods were just woods. Looked around, tried to see if there were any tracks in the snow along the side of the road. But there wasn't much snow, just patches of ice and frozen ground. Couldn't see anything, just normal forest. Felt even stupider then, like I was chasing ghosts, like I was losing my mind. But as I stood there staring into the trees on the far side of the guardrail, a shiver went down my spine. Even in the daylight, with the sun trying to break through the clouds, I felt uneasy. Like something was still there, watching, hidden in the trees. Got back in the truck, drove home, tried to put it out of my mind. Told myself it was just fatigue, stress, shadows playing tricks in the dark. Tried to convince myself it was just a big dog, or, I don't know, something else normal that my tired brain had blown out of proportion. But I couldn't shake it. That image, that feeling, the way it moved, the wrongness of it. Didn't tell anyone about it for a long time. Figured they'd think I was crazy, living out in the woods by myself. People already think you're a bit weird anyway. Didn't want to give them any more ammunition. Eventually, years later, I mentioned it to a guy I worked with, Hank. We were talking about strange things we'd seen, campfire talk. And I told him about that night on 550. Just kind of matter-of-factly, like it wasn't a big deal. Hank, though, he went quiet, stared at me for a long moment, and then he said, real slow and serious, "You saw the dogman." The what? He told me about the stories, legends he called them, about these creatures, dogmen, werewolves, skinwalkers, all sorts of names. Said people had been seeing them in the woods around here for years. Especially out towards Cascade Hills, especially near Sugarloaf. I'd never heard of any of that stuff before. Thought it was all just campfire stories, scary tales to spook the kids. But Hank, he was dead serious. He said he knew people who'd seen them, heard them, felt them watching. Said there were things out there in the woods that we didn't understand, things older than us, wilder than us, and dangerous. He told me about the red eyes some people claimed to see, about the growls, the howls, that didn't sound like any animal they knew, about the feeling of being watched, even when there was nothing there. And the more he talked, the more a cold dread settled over me. Because what he was describing, it felt familiar. Too familiar. That reddish-brown fur, the way it moved, the feeling of wrongness. Maybe it wasn't just my imagination. Maybe it wasn't just shadows and fatigue. Maybe I really did see something real, something else. I don't know what it was. To this day, I still don't. I try not to think about it. But sometimes late at night, when I'm driving home from work and the road gets dark and the trees close in, I remember that feeling, that icy, gut-twisting fear. And I can't help but wonder, what's really out there in the dark? And is it still watching? I moved out of the cabin a few years later, couldn't take it anymore. Too quiet, too lonely, too much darkness. Live closer to town now, apartment building, lots of people around, street lights. Don't drive 550 at night if I can help it. Still think about it sometimes, though, especially in November, when the nights get long and the cold sets in, and the woods. They just feel different. Feel like they're holding their breath, waiting for something. Yeah, still not completely okay. Stuff like that changes you. Story 4. It was summer of '96, and the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt, the kind that hung thick and heavy. Cascade Hills wasn't exactly a bustling metropolis. Back then, especially the south side, felt like the edge of nowhere, all dusty trails and forgotten logging roads. For kids like us, Tiago, Marco, Pedro and me, we practically lived on those trails. Freedom on 2 wheels, that's what it felt like. Dirt bikes weren't fancy, just old hand-me-downs and whatever we could patch together. But they were our tickets out. We were ripping down Old Forest Road 553. It wasn't even really a road anymore, more like a track eaten away by time and trees, branches clawing in from both sides. The sun was beating down, baking the dirt to a crisp, and the only sounds were the buzzing of our engines and the crunch of gravel under our tires. We were pushing it, seeing who could get the most air off little bumps, kicking up dust clouds that tasted like pine needles and hot earth. We were coming up on this fallen tree, a big old pine that had probably come down in a storm years ago, lying right across part of the trail, forcing us to go around. That's when it happened. It was just a flick of movement, something at the very edge of my vision, over to the right, deeper into the woods. Nothing concrete, just a shift in the shadows that caught my eye. I remember squeezing my brakes almost instinctively, a hand gesture more than a thought. My bike coughed and slowed, and the others almost ran into me, brakes squealing, curses being yelled about why I'd braked so hard. "What? What's wrong?" Marco shouted, his voice all edged with impatience, revving his engine behind me. I didn't answer right away. My eyes were still locked on that spot, over by a scraggly patch of bushes and some smaller trees, off the side of the old road. It was still, mostly hidden. For a second, I thought maybe it was just the heat playing tricks, or a deer bedded down in the shade. But then, it moved again. Slowly, almost like it was unsure, or maybe trying not to be seen, something shifted. It was low to the ground, crouched down, blended into the undergrowth at first glance. But it was there. I could see it now, in bits and pieces, through the leaves and branches, dark, bulky shape. And then it started to turn its head. My breath caught. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I recognized. Anything I could put a name to from all the woods we'd ridden through, all the animals we'd seen. It turned its head slowly, deliberately, and that's when its eyes locked onto mine. They were wrong. That's the only word I can think of. Just wrong. They reflected the light in a way that wasn't natural, too bright, too intense. They seemed to glow, almost, like something burning behind them. "Guys!" I finally managed, my voice coming out strangled, barely more than a croak. I pointed, my hand shaking slightly, towards the thing hunched down in the trees. "Look, over there. What is that?" They followed my gaze, engines still rumbling impatiently. Pedro, always the first to react, squinted, then swore under his breath. Marco just went silent. Tiago, who was a bit braver than the rest of us, actually started to push his bike closer, curiosity overriding caution for a second. As we watched, frozen, the creature, that's the only word that comes to mind, because animal felt insufficient, started to rise. Slowly, deliberately, it unfolded itself from that crouched position. It stood on two legs, but not upright, not like a person. It was hunched over, its back curved, its arms hanging down, almost touching the ground. It was bigger than I'd first thought, taller than any of us standing up, even hunched over like that. It was covered in fur, thick and matted, a dull, dark brown, almost black in places. Not like a bear's fur, smoother almost. Shaggy, like it hadn't been groomed, ever. Its arms were long, disproportionately so, like a gorilla's, maybe even longer, but its legs seemed shorter, thicker. It was all out of proportion, like nature had thrown different pieces together and hoped for the best, but ended up with something deeply unsettling. And then there was the face, or what I could see of it. It was mostly hidden, obscured by the shadow of a brow ridge, or maybe fur, I don't know. But those eyes, they were still burning, fixing on us. I couldn't make out any features, really. No nose, no mouth that I could clearly define, just darkness and those eyes. It took a step, hesitantly, towards the road, out of the shadows and into the sunlight filtering through the trees. It stopped right in the middle of the track, maybe 20, 30 feet away from us, just standing there, staring. That moment. It felt like time stretched out. Everything went silent except for the frantic thumping of my own heart. The buzzing of insects in the trees seemed to fade away. Even the hot summer air seemed to hold its breath. It was just us and it. Fear, real icy fear, started to grip me then. Not just the adrenaline rush of almost crashing or the quick scare of jumping a ramp too fast. This was different. This felt primal, like something ancient had just stepped out of the woods and was looking at us, judging us. But there was also a weird kind of fascination mixed in with the terror. I'd never seen anything like it. None of us had. We'd grown up in those woods. We knew every deer trail, every rabbit run, every hawk's nest. We'd seen bears, coyotes, foxes, even a bobcat once, way off in the distance. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't acting like any animal I knew. It wasn't growling or hissing or making any noise at all. It wasn't running away, which seemed like the normal animal reaction to 4 noisy dirt bikes and a bunch of yelling teenagers. It was just observing us. And those eyes, they felt like they were seeing right through me, stripping away all pretense, all bravado. After what felt like an eternity, probably just seconds, maybe a minute at most, the creature finally moved again. It didn't charge us, thank God. Instead, it shifted its gaze, looked over to its right, down towards a small ravine that dropped down into a steeper part of the woods. It was like it was calculating, figuring out an escape route. Then, faster than I could have ever imagined, it moved. It turned, almost fluidly, despite its bulky form, and lunged towards the ravine. It scrambled down the embankment, not stumbling, not slipping on the loose dirt, but moving with a speed and agility that was shocking. In seconds, it was at the bottom of the ravine, and then it was gone, disappearing into the dense trees and undergrowth below. Just gone. Like it had never been there. We just stood there, frozen, bikes idling roughly, the silence returning, but now charged with a thick, unspoken fear. It took a few seconds for any of us to move, to break the spell. Did you guys just see that? Pedro finally stammered, his voice shaky, disbelieving. Marco just nodded slowly, his eyes wide, still staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared. Tiago was pale, his usual cocky grin completely wiped off his face. What the hell was that? I managed to get out, my voice still hoarse. Seriously, what was that thing? Nobody had an answer. We talked about it right there on the trail, engines off now, the heat pressing down on us again. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear, but no, it didn't look like a bear. Bears are heavy set, lumbering. This thing was different. And those eyes. Bears don't have eyes like that. Maybe a big dog, some kind of wild dog. But again, the shape, the fur, the way it moved, it didn't fit. And the size. It was huge, too big for any dog. We cycled back to town slowly, quietly, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving behind a cold residue of fear and confusion. Nobody said much. We were all processing what we'd seen, or what we thought we'd seen. We knew we'd all seen the same thing. There was no doubt about that. We'd all reacted the same way, felt the same jolt of fear, the same disbelief. Back at my house, I couldn't shake it. I kept seeing those eyes in my head, that strange, bulky form disappearing into the woods. I tried to look it up, in my dad's old encyclopedias, in books about local wildlife, even online, though the internet back then wasn't what it is now. I searched for unusual animals, forest creatures, wildlife of Cascade Hills. Nothing. Absolutely nothing that even remotely resembled what we'd seen. We talked about it for weeks afterwards at school, hanging out. We argued, debated, tried to make sense of it. Marco, who was always the most level-headed, suggested it could have been someone in a costume, a prank. But even he didn't sound convinced. And who would be out in the middle of nowhere, in that heat, in a heavy, terrifying costume, just to scare some kids on bikes? It made no sense. Pedro, always the more imaginative one, started talking about Bigfoot and other legends, whispering about cryptids and creatures that science couldn't explain. Tiago, normally the skeptic, got quieter and quieter about it, like he was genuinely disturbed by what we'd seen. And me, I just felt this deep unease, like we'd stumbled across something we weren't supposed to see, something that existed just outside the edges of our understanding, hidden in the shadows of the woods. We never went back to Forest Road 553 that summer. Or ever, really. We found other trails, other places to ride. But something shifted in all of us that day. That carefree feeling of freedom on the trails, the certainty that we knew our woods, it was gone. Replaced by a nagging doubt, a feeling that maybe there were things out there, hidden in plain sight, that we couldn't understand. I've told this story a few times over the years, mostly to close friends, always hesitant, always feeling a bit ridiculous saying it out loud. People usually look at me with polite disbelief or try to come up with rational explanations. And honestly, I get it. It sounds crazy. I know it does. Sometimes, late at night, lying in bed, I almost convince myself that we imagined it, that it was just some trick of the light, or heat stroke, or teenage imagination running wild. But then I remember those eyes, that burning, unnatural glow, and the sheer paralyzing fear I felt when I looked at that thing. And I know, deep down, that what we saw that day, out on Forest Road 553, it was real, and I still have no idea what it was, and part of me is still terrified of ever finding out. Story 5. Okay, so this happened back in the summer of '91. I was living up in the UP, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you know? Pine and hardwood country, real backwoods kind of place. My family had a little cabin out past Paradise, kind of deep in the woods, you know, the kind of place you went to really get away from it all. We spent most of the summer up there every year. I loved it. Still do, actually. But after this, well, it changed things a little. I had this horse back then, Prata. Beautiful silver grey, hence the name, Prata. Portuguese for silver. My grandpa was from Portugal. He picked the name. Anyway, Prata was the best. We'd ride all over, explore trails, sometimes just go off trail completely. That summer, I was probably about 16, maybe 17, something like that. Old enough to feel invincible, you know? Too old to be scared of the dark or anything stupid like that. Or so I thought. It was late afternoon, getting close to dusk. I decided to take Prata out for one last ride before it got too dark. Told my dad I wouldn't go far, just wanted to stretch our legs a bit. He just grunted like he always did, didn't really care what I did as long as I was back for dinner. Mom was inside cooking. I could smell something grilling, probably burgers. Normal summer evening. I saddled Prata up, feeling that familiar excitement you get when you're about to ride. It wasn't just riding a horse, it was freedom, you know? Just me and him, out in the woods. We headed out, just walking at first, down the dirt road away from the cabin. It was getting dusky, the long shadows were stretching out from the trees across the road. The air was cooling down, starting to get that evening chill. Crickets were starting up their chorus, that buzzing sound that fills the woods at night. Everything felt normal, peaceful. We'd gone maybe a mile and a half, just a nice leisurely walk. I was enjoying the quiet, the smell of pine and damp earth. Prata was being his usual calm self, just ambling along, his ears flicking now and then, listening to the woods. Then it happened. We were rounding a bend in the road, a place where the trees got really thick, closed in on both sides of the road. The woods there are dense, even in the daytime, kind of dark and shadowy. Suddenly, Prata just stopped, like he'd run into a brick wall. He wasn't usually spooky, not like some horses are. He was solid, dependable, so for him to just freeze like that, it was unusual. I instinctively tensed up. Something was wrong. I could feel it in Prata, that stiffening, that alertness. His muscles were tight under me, and his ears were locked forward, pointing straight into the darkness of the woods on our right. He wasn't moving, just completely still, except for his breathing, which was starting to get a little faster. "Hey," "Easy, boy," I murmured, trying to soothe him, trying to figure out what he was spooked by. I scanned the woods, squinting into the shadows. It was getting darker fast now, the light fading from the sky. I couldn't see anything at first. Just trees, underbrush, the usual wood stuff, maybe a deer. But Prata didn't usually react to deer like this. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was another horse. Dumb, I know, out in the middle of nowhere in the deep woods, but that was my first thought. There was something pale in the trees, deeper in, maybe 30, 40 yards into the woods, a pale shape like white smoke almost, but solid. It was hard to make out details in the gloom of the trees, but it was definitely big and white. It moved. It wasn't a deer. It was too big, too wrongly shaped for a deer. As it moved, it came out from behind the thicker trees into a slightly more open patch of woods, and the last shred of doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, creeping horror that started in my stomach and spread out through my whole body. It was a horse, or it looked like a horse, but it was all wrong. It was white, not just pale or grey, but stark white, like snow or bone. And it was big, bigger than Prata, bigger than any horse I'd ever seen. It moved with a strange flowing gait, not like a normal horse trots or canters. It was like it was gliding, almost floating just above the ground. And it was fast. It was moving directly towards us through the trees, picking up speed. I stared, completely frozen myself now. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no sense to be made. This thing, it shouldn't exist. It was coming closer, impossibly fast, weaving through the trees without even slowing down. Its whiteness seemed to glow in the dim light, like it was reflecting some unseen light source. And as it got closer, I started to see details. Or rather, the lack of details. It was like a horse carved out of white stone or ice. Everything was smooth, almost featureless. I couldn't see eyes or a mouth or a mane, not clearly anyway. It was just a white shape, the shape of a horse, but empty, hollow, ghostly. My blood was turning to ice. Fear, real, raw, animal fear, was gripping me. This wasn't just some strange animal. This was something else, something unnatural. It was maybe 30 yards away now, closing fast. I could hear Prata breathing hard, his nostrils flared. I could feel him trembling beneath me. He was terrified too. We were both paralyzed, staring at this apparition bearing down on us. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it stopped. It was maybe 30 feet away, right at the edge of the road, where the trees were thickest. It froze in mid-stride, one leg lifted like a statue, completely still, and then it turned its head, or the shape where its head should be turned. I still couldn't see any features, no eyes, but I felt like it was looking right at me, right through me. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't just scary. It was wrong, profoundly wrong. It stood there, motionless, for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. The silence in the woods seemed to deepen, to become heavier, pressing in on me. The crickets had stopped chirping. Everything was silent except for Prata's ragged breathing and the pounding of my own heart. Then, in another instant, it was gone. It didn't run, or gallop, or even move. It just vanished, like someone had flipped a switch and turned it off. 1 second it was there, stark white against the dark trees. The next second, nothing. Just the trees, the shadows, and the growing darkness. The silence after it disappeared was deafening. It was like the world had held its breath, and now it was just exhaling a slow, cold sigh. The air felt different, colder somehow, thinner. I blinked. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was hallucinating, maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But Prata was still frozen solid, still trembling. He hadn't imagined it. and the feeling of absolute bone-deep dread was still clinging to me, cold and clammy. I didn't wait to try and figure it out. Didn't try to be brave, didn't try to rationalize it. Instinct took over. I hauled on Prater's reins, spun him around and kicked him into a gallop. "Go, boy, go!" I yelled, more to myself than to him. He needed no encouragement. He bolted, galloping back down the road, faster than I'd ever ridden him before. The trees blurred past, the ground pounded under his hooves. I leaned low in the saddle, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I just wanted to get back to the cabin, back to the light, back to normal. We burst out of the woods and into the little clearing where the cabin was. The lights were on inside, smoke was curling from the chimney, everything looked safe, familiar, real. It was like coming back from another world. I slid off Prater, my legs shaky and weak. He was blowing hard, his sides heaving. I didn't even bother to untack him properly. I just loosened the girth and let the saddle slide off onto the ground, then stumbled towards the cabin, leaving Prater standing there, still spooked and on edge. I slammed the cabin door open and practically fell inside. My mum looked up from the stove, surprised. "Sam, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." You won't believe it," I stammered, trying to catch my breath, trying to find the words. "In the woods, back there, I tried to describe it, the white horse, the way it moved, the way it disappeared. I must have sounded like a crazy person, babbling and wide-eyed. My dad came over from his chair by the fire, looking at me like I was nuts. A white horse? In the woods? Sam, you probably saw a deer in the fog. Or maybe a stray cow from Miller's farm got loose again." He chuckled like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all day. "No, it wasn't a deer. It wasn't a cow. It was like a ghost horse. It was white as snow, and it moved like it wasn't real, and it just vanished. Poof! Gone!" I insisted, getting more and more frustrated. They just weren't taking me seriously. My mom tried to be more sympathetic, but I could see the doubt in her eyes too. "Honey, maybe you were just tired, and the light was playing tricks. It was getting dark, you know, and the woods can be spooky at dusk." "Tricks?" I almost shouted. "Mom, I know what I saw. Prater saw it too. He was terrified." "You think Prater would be scared by a deer?" They just exchanged glances, those knowing parental glances that say, "Kids, they have such imaginations." They laughed again, softer this time, but still laughing, and I just shut up. What was the point? They wouldn't believe me. No one would. It sounded insane, even to my own ears when I tried to describe it. A ghostly white horse in the woods that disappears into thin air? Yeah, right. I went to my room, feeling a mix of fear, anger, and frustration. I looked out the window at the darkening woods, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. They looked normal, peaceful, deceptively peaceful. I never went riding in those woods alone again, not after dusk anyway. And even in the daytime, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching from the shadows. That white shape burned into my memory, cold and silent and wrong. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw. Foggy deer, stray cow, please. This was something else. Something else. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling outside and the trees are creaking, I still think about it. That white horse standing there at the edge of the woods. And I still get that same cold shiver down my spine, the same feeling of unexplained dread. It was just gone, like it never existed at all. And that's what's really unsettling, the way it just stopped. And then, nothing. Just nothing. Story 6. Okay, so this happened back in '99, spring of '99 to be exact. It was still chilly in the mornings, you know, that kind of cold that bites through your jacket even if the sun's trying its best to peek through. Thompson Woods, where I lived at the time, was just starting to come alive again after winter. You could smell the damp earth and that fresh green smell that always means spring is finally here. I'm a morning person, always have been. Back then my routine was pretty simple. Every morning before work I'd go for a walk in the woods. Helped clear my head, you know. Thompson Woods wasn't exactly wilderness, but it was big enough and pretty secluded in parts. There was this winding dirt road, not really a road, more like a track that ran alongside Dark Creek. That was my go-to spot. Quiet, peaceful, and you always saw some kind of wildlife if you were patient and kept your eyes open. Deer, mostly. Sometimes a bear, though not too often. Never anything too out of the ordinary, which is why what happened is still messing with me all these years later. That particular morning, everything felt normal at first. The air was crisp. The sun was trying to break through the trees, making those long shadows across the track. I was just strolling along, hands in my pockets, listening to the birds starting to chirp and get their day going. The creek was babbling away to my left, that constant background noise that's usually comforting. Then I heard it, rustling in the undergrowth. Nothing unusual, really. Could be anything, squirrels, rabbits, like I said. Even deer were common. But this rustling, it was different. It was louder, heavier somehow, and moving fast. Too fast for a deer, I thought. Maybe a bear, but it sounded different from the lumbering, crashing sound a bear makes. This was more agile. I stopped walking, just stood there listening, kind of curious, kind of cautious. The rustling was getting closer, coming from deeper in the woods, away from the creek, moving towards the track. I figured whatever it was would probably cross the track and head down to the water. And then I saw it. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking at. It was white. That's the first thing that hit me, just this flash of white moving through the trees. Not like a white animal, like a deer with unusual coloring or something. No, this was intensely white, like bleached white. It was moving fast, insanely fast, faster than anything I've ever seen move through woods like that. We're talking weaving through thick trees, leaping over fallen logs, going uphill and downhill, and it was doing it all at what looked like full sprint. But there wasn't that clumsy thrashing you'd expect from something moving that quickly through dense woods. It was fluid, almost gliding. I just stood there, rooted to the spot. My brain was trying to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. It was tall, definitely taller than a person, like way taller. And it was shaped like a person, kind of. Tall and thin, with arms and legs, but all stretched out, elongated, almost unnatural. And it was completely white, head to toe, like it was wearing some kind of white suit. But it wasn't clothing, not in the way it moved. It was like the whiteness was it. It crossed a small clearing, and I got a clearer view for maybe a second, 2 seconds tops. That's when the speed really hit me. It covered the clearing in a blink. It was like watching something teleport in short bursts, and the way it moved, it wasn't running like a person runs. It was more like bounding, huge strides, covering impossible distances with each step. And it wasn't making any noise, not really, just that faint rustling of branches as it brushed past, but nothing like the crashing you'd expect from something moving that fast and that big. It was almost silent. Then it was gone. Just like that. Vanished back into the trees on the other side of the track and was swallowed up by the woods. 1 second it was there, a flash of white, and the next just trees and shadows. I stood there for what felt like a long time, just staring at the spot where it had disappeared. My heart was hammering in my chest. My breath was coming in short gasps. I felt cold, not just the morning chill, a coldness that came from inside, like something had sucked the warmth right out of me. My mind was racing. What the hell was that? Bear? No. Definitely not a bear. Deer? Absolutely not. Human? No way. No human moves like that. And the height, the whiteness, it just didn't make any sense. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the way the light was playing tricks. Maybe it was mist or fog that looked solid because of the trees behind it. But no, that was bullshit. I saw it clearly. Tall, white, moving faster than anything should be able to move in those woods. I started walking again, but my morning walk was ruined. The peace was gone. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that white figure burst out of the trees again. I finished my walk early, turned around and headed back home. I felt spooked. That's the only word for it. Deeply, profoundly spooked. I couldn't shake the image of that white thing from my mind. The speed, the unnatural movements, the stark whiteness against the dark woods. It was burned into my brain. When I got home, I tried to act normal, made coffee, got ready for work. But I was distracted all day, thinking about what I saw, trying to make sense of it. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I'd seen something, maybe a deer in the fog, and my mind had blown it out of proportion. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew I'd seen something real, something wrong. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind in the trees outside my window made me jump. I kept seeing that white figure in my mind's eye, running through the woods. The next morning, I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably nothing, just some trick of the light. I needed to get over it. But there was this pull, a weird kind of curiosity mixed with a healthy dose of fear. I felt like I had to go back. I had to see if there was anything at all to explain what I saw. So I went back to the woods, same time as the day before, same route along Dark Creek. The morning was similar too, maybe a bit less chilly, the sun a little stronger, but the air felt different, heavier, like something was watching. I walked the same stretch of track where I'd seen the white figure. My eyes were scanning everything, the trees, the undergrowth, the track itself. I didn't really know what I was looking for. Proof. Confirmation that I hadn't imagined it. Maybe just something. I reached the small clearing where I'd gotten the clearest glimpse of it, and that's when I saw them. In the mud beside Dark Creek, footprints, but not like any footprints I'd ever seen before. They were huge, seriously huge. I wear a size 11 shoe. These things made my feet look tiny. I'd guess they were at least 18 inches long, maybe more, and wide, much wider than a human foot. And the toes. There were 3, clearly defined, distinct toes. But, and this is the really weird part, there were hints of more. Faint impressions in the mud, almost like ghost toes around the main 3, like there should have been more toes, but they weren't fully formed, or maybe they were just less solid. The prints were deep in the mud, which meant whatever made them was heavy, really heavy, and the spacing between them, massive strides, just like I'd seen. They were spaced so far apart, it would be impossible for a normal person to take steps that long, even running full out. It confirmed what I'd seen, the impossible speed, the unnatural movement. I followed the prints along the creek bank for a little while. They went into the water, then came out the other side, deeper into the woods. I didn't follow them too far. I didn't want to. The closer I looked at those prints, the colder I felt. That same icy feeling from the day before, but stronger this time. That's when something my neighbor used to say popped into my head. Old Man Hemlock. Crazy guy, everyone in town thought. He lived way out in the woods, off the grid. He was always talking about Bigfoot. Said he'd seen it multiple times. We all just laughed at him, thought he was nuts. But Old Man Hemlock, he'd always talked about tracks. Big tracks in the mud. Tracks with funny toes. He never said 3 toes exactly, but he always described them as being wrong. Like not quite human, not quite animal. Suddenly, Old Man Hemlock didn't seem so crazy anymore. My hands started to shake. I backed away from the prints, slowly, keeping my eyes on them like they might get up and chase me or something. I turned around and practically ran back to the track and then back home. I didn't go back to the woods after that. Not for a long, long time. Even now, years later, I still don't go back there, not really. I drive past Thompson Woods sometimes on the highway, and I still get that chill, that same cold feeling. I've tried to explain it, what I saw, to people, but they just look at me like I'm crazy too, like Old Man Hemlock. They laugh it off, say it was a deer, or shadows, or my imagination. But I know what I saw, and I know what those prints looked like. And sometimes late at night when everything's quiet, I think I hear something rustling outside my window, something heavy, moving fast. And I get this image in my head, that tall white figure running through the trees. And I wonder, what if it's still out there? What if it's still in Thompson Woods? And what if it's not just alone? Story 7. It was getting properly late, you know, the kind of late in the woods when the shadows stretch out long and thin and everything starts to look a little different, a little off. November 2009. The air was cold, that sharp, bitey cold that gets right into your bones, especially when you're sitting still for hours, waiting for a buck to wander into your sights. Me and Lucas, my grandson, we'd been out in Argyll Swamp since just after lunch, hoping to bag a decent deer before the season ended. Lucas, he was only 12 back then, skinny as a rake, all elbows and knees, but full of energy, bouncing around even in the cold. He was quiet enough when he needed to be, though, understood hunting was about patience and listening. We'd hiked way in, deeper than we usually go, wanting to try a new spot I'd heard about from a buddy. Argyll Swamp is big, and parts of it, especially further in, are wild. Real wild. The sun was already starting to dip below the tree line, painting everything in these long streaks of orange and purple. Beautiful, yeah. But also the light that makes the woods feel different. Animals get more active, shadows play tricks on your eyes, sounds carry further. We hadn't seen a damn thing all afternoon except squirrels and a couple of jays squawking at us, which was starting to get frustrating. We were both getting cold and, truth be told, a little hungry. "All right, Lucas," I said quietly, not wanting to spook anything that might be nearby. "Reckon we should pack it in, lights fading fast." He nodded, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Yeah, Grandpa, I'm freezing." We started gathering up our stuff. My rifle, Lucas's smaller .22, our backpacks, the folding stools we'd been sitting on. We were being careful, quiet, even though we were heading out, just out of habit more than anything. You never know when a deer might wander by at the last minute. We'd only gone maybe 50 yards, maybe less, heading back the way we came, when all hell broke loose in the woods to our right. Not hell, not really, but chaos. The underbrush exploded with sound. Crashing, snapping, thrashing. It wasn't like a deer bounding away. This was heavier, louder, like something big and clumsy was tearing through the trees. My heart jumped right into my throat. I froze, hand instinctively going for my rifle. Lucas gasped next to me, eyes wide. We both just stood there, listening, rifles half raised, pointed in the direction of the noise, ready for anything, or at least thinking we were. Then it happened. A deer burst out of the thickest part of the brush, running like it had the devil himself on its heels. A decent buck, 6 points, maybe 8, white tail flashing as it bolted past us, maybe 30 feet away. It was moving so fast, so panicked, you could almost feel the fear radiating off it. We watched it go, surprised, confused. Bucks don't usually run like that unless something is really scaring them, something serious. And then, whatever was chasing it came into view. It wasn't a bear. I've seen bears in these woods before. This was nothing I'd ever seen. It was dark, impossibly dark, like a shadow given shape. It was huge, towering up out of the trees, taller than any man, taller than any bear, taller than anything that should be walking on 2 legs in those woods. It moved weird, not quite smoothly, more like a lumbering kind of movement, but fast. God, it was fast. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair, black as pitch in the fading light, and it just loomed. That's the only word for it, loomed. It stepped out of the trees right where the deer had come from, and for a split second, maybe less than a second, it just stood there. facing us. It was like it was as surprised to see us as we were to see it. It had its arms kind of outstretched, bent at the elbows, hands dangling down, almost like claws, I guess, though I didn't get a real good look. It was too dark. Its face. I couldn't make out features, not clearly, just dark sockets where eyes should be, reflecting no light. Its face was mostly hidden by the hair, but I saw a shape, vaguely human, but wrong. Too big, too heavy, too brutal. It was tall, I'm telling you, at least 8 feet, maybe more, and thick, broad. It wasn't just tall and skinny, it was massive, powerful looking, like a walking tree trunk, but alive. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would break. Time seemed to slow down. Everything went quiet except the roaring in my ears. Fear, pure, ice-cold fear just washed over me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stared, locked onto this thing, this creature that shouldn't exist, standing in front of me in the fading light of the swamp. Lucas was beside me, frozen solid too. I could feel him trembling. I didn't dare look away from the thing to check on him. I was afraid to move a muscle, afraid to breathe too loud. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it shifted. It seemed to shake its head, or maybe just reorient its attention. I don't know. But it turned away from us, just like that. Turned its back on us. It didn't run, not exactly, but it moved fast, with long strides, heading away from us, deeper into the woods, to the southeast, like the premise said, towards the darkest, thickest part of the swamp. It disappeared into the trees in seconds. Gone, just like it had never been there. Except it had been. We'd both seen it. We'd both felt the presence of it, the raw animal power of it. For a long minute, maybe 2, we didn't move. We just stood there, staring at the spot where it had vanished, the silence ringing in our ears. The woods, which had been starting to feel eerie even before all this, were now just terrifying. Finally, Lucas's voice, small and shaky, broke the silence. Did you see that, Grandpa? Did you see that big black thing?" His voice trembled, and I could see in the corner of my eye he was still staring at the woods, his face pale. I managed to swallow, my throat tight and dry. "Yeah, Lucas. Yeah, I saw it." My voice was rougher than I expected, almost a croak. I slowly lowered my rifle, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. I clicked the safety back on, automatically, just like I always do, even though my mind was still racing, still trying to make sense of what we had just seen. There was no sense to be made. What was it?" Lucas whispered, his eyes wide and scared. I don't know, Lucas," I said honestly. "I honestly don't know." And I didn't. I'd hunted these woods my whole life, seen all kinds of animals, big and small, but never anything like that. Never. I knew what people would say. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, crazy stories you hear around campfires, stories you laugh off. But standing there, with the image of that thing burned into my mind, the smell of the woods suddenly sharper, the silence heavier, campfire stories didn't seem so funny anymore. They felt real, too real. "Come on," I said finally, my voice gaining a little strength. "Let's get back to the truck." I kept my rifle in my hands, safety off now, just in case. Not that I thought a bullet would do much good against something that size, something that unknowable. But it was something to hold, something familiar in all this strangeness. We started walking, faster than before, pushing through the undergrowth, not even trying to be quiet now. I kept looking over my shoulder, every shadow seeming to move, every rustle of leaves making me jump. Lucas was right behind me, practically glued to my back, his little .22 clutched tight in his hands. He didn't say anything else, just followed me, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The woods seemed to close in around us as the last of the light faded. It got colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your clothes and chills you to the core. Every sound seemed amplified, the snap of a twig under our boots, the hoot of an owl far off, the wind sighing through the trees. Every shadow looked like it. We walked like that, fast and tense, for what felt like forever, but was probably only 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. It was long enough. Long enough to let the fear settle in, to burrow deep. Long enough to start questioning what I'd seen, to start wondering if I was going crazy, if my eyes had played tricks on me. But no, Lucas had seen it too. He'd been just as scared, just as shocked. Finally, we broke out of the thick trees and into the more open woods, closer to the logging road where we'd parked the truck. Seeing the road, even in the gloom, was like seeing a lifeline. We almost ran the last bit, stumbling over roots and fallen branches in our haste. When we finally reached the truck, I fumbled with the keys, my hands still shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. I unlocked the doors, and Lucas practically dove into the passenger seat. I slammed my door, locked it, and started the engine. The roar of the engine was almost deafening, but it was a welcome sound, a normal sound, something real and familiar. I switched on the headlights, bathing the woods in front of us in a beam of light, and it felt a little better, a little safer, even though I knew that light wouldn't reach far into the darkness. I didn't say anything. Lucas didn't say anything. I just put the truck in gear and drove as fast as I dared on that bumpy logging road, bouncing and rattling all the way back to the main road. We didn't talk. There wasn't anything to say, not really. What do you say after you've seen something like that? Something impossible. We drove all the way home in silence, the heater blasting, the radio off. Lucas was slumped in his seat, staring out the window, his face still pale. I glanced at him a few times, but he just kept staring out, lost in his own thoughts. I was lost in mine, replaying the image of that thing in my mind, over and over again. When we got back to my place, his parents were there to pick him up. He barely said goodbye, just mumbled something and hurried inside their car. I watched them drive away, and then I just stood there in the driveway for a while, looking back towards the woods, the trees dark and still in the night. I haven't been back to Argyle Swamp since then. Not deep in like that anyway. I still hunt, but I stick to the closer areas, the places where you can hear the traffic on the highway, where you don't feel so isolated. And I never told anyone. Not really. Not properly. How do you tell someone you saw a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot? They'd laugh. Or worse, they'd think you were crazy. Even my wife, bless her soul, she'd just shake her head and say I'd been out in the woods too long, breathing in too much swamp gas. But I know what I saw, and Lucas knows what he saw. We both saw it, and that's enough. It's enough to keep me awake some nights thinking about it. Thinking about what else is out there in the woods, in the places where people don't go, in the shadows just beyond the edge of the light. And I tell you what, sometimes when I'm out in the woods, even in the daytime, I still get that feeling, that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like something is watching me, like something is still out there, waiting, and I can't explain it, not really, I just know it happened, and it changed the way I look at the woods, forever. Story 8. Okay, so I don't usually talk about this, especially not online, but I've seen some of the things people share here and, well, it felt like maybe someone might understand. This happened a long time ago, back when I was just a kid, maybe around 7 or 8. It was in the fall, September, I think, because the leaves were just starting to turn, you know, that yellow-brownish color. Not full-on autumn yet, but definitely hinting at it. We were at my grandma's house. She lived way out in the country, surrounded by woods. Real woods, not like a park. Deep, thick woods that just went on forever. My aunt, my cousin Michael, who was a year or two older than me, and I decided we were going to build a fort. Kids, right? We always wanted to build forts. My grandma's property backed right up against these woods, and we'd been told 1,000,000 times not to go too far in, but you know, kids. We packed up some stuff, a hammer, some old nails we'd snuck from my grandpa's shed, and we were scavenging wood from around the yard. Nothing fancy, just bits and pieces of scrap wood. We tromped into the woods, not too far at first anyway. We found this little clearing, kind of tucked away but still close enough to the edge that we could run back to the house if we needed to. We started piling up branches and leaning boards against a couple of trees. It was hard work, even for kids hyped up on adventure. The air was that crisp September air, a little cool, but the sun was strong, making patches of light filter down through the leaves. Around lunchtime, my aunt called us in for sandwiches. We came scrambling out of the woods, all sweaty and covered in dirt and bits of leaves. We sat out on the porch, eating our lunch. We were talking and laughing, just normal kid stuff, showing off our splinters. Then, while we were eating, I heard something snap in the woods behind us, just a sharp crack, like a branch breaking. I stopped chewing and looked up. It was quiet for a second, and then I heard it again, a little further in. More snapping sounds and some rustling in the leaves, like something moving but trying to be quiet about it. I nudged Michael and pointed towards the woods. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He was too busy shoving half a sandwich in his mouth to really pay attention. "Probably just squirrels," he mumbled. But I knew it wasn't squirrels. Squirrels were always loud and chattery, not sneaky. This was different. Then I saw it. Just for a second, a flash of something moving between the trees. It was further back, deeper into the woods than where we were building the fort. It was brown, a dark, kind of dusty brown. It moved quickly, darting behind a thick tree trunk. I blinked, and it was gone. Just leaves rustling slightly in its wake. I was a little freaked out, but I didn't want to seem scared. I mean, I was the youngest, so I just said, kind of casually, "Hey, was that you back there, Michael? Messing around?" He finally swallowed his sandwich and looked at me, confused. "Messing around where?" he asked. "In the woods," I said, gesturing behind the house. "I thought I saw you, like running around." He frowned. "No, I've been right here with you guys the whole time. Why would I be in the woods?" I shrugged. "I don't know, I just thought maybe you went back to get more wood or something." He shook his head, and my aunt, who'd been listening to us, said, "Maybe it was just an animal, Sarah. A deer or something." That sounded kind of reasonable. We had seen deer in the woods before, but this didn't move like a deer. It was too shadowy, too quick. I let it go, though. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. We finished lunch and went back to working on the fort. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the woods, but I didn't see anything else. We worked until it started getting late in the afternoon. Then my aunt called us in again, and we headed back to the house. Later that evening, we were all sitting in the living room with my grandma. My grandma was asking us about our day, and Michael was telling her all about the fort, how big it was going to be, all that kid stuff. And then, just out of nowhere, I remembered what I'd seen in the woods, and something clicked in my brain. I turned to Michael and said, "Hey, Michael, what color shirt were you wearing today?" It was just a random question, I guess, but it was important to me for some reason. He looked down at his shirt, like he'd forgotten what he was wearing. "De blue," he said. "Yeah, my blue one." And that's when it hit me. The thing I saw in the woods, it was brown. Not blue, definitely not blue. A cold shiver went right down my spine. I didn't say anything to anyone else, not then. I just sat there, quiet, trying to process what that meant. It wasn't Michael, so what was it? And why was it in the woods, hiding, moving like that? The rest of the week, I couldn't really shake it off. The image of that brown shape, disappearing behind the trees, kept replaying in my mind. I started having trouble sleeping. Every little sound outside my bedroom window at night would make me jump. I was convinced that thing, whatever it was still out there. We were supposed to go home at the end of the week, but for some reason we ended up staying longer. I think my mum was sick or something. So the next weekend, my aunt, Michael, and I went back to my grandma's again. And of course, Michael was itching to finish the fort. He kept talking about it the whole car ride over. I was less enthusiastic. I didn't really want to go back into those woods, not after what I'd seen. But I didn't want to admit I was scared, especially not to Michael. So we went. It was another sunny day, but it felt different this time. The air felt heavier, colder somehow, even with the sun shining. The woods seemed darker, quieter. When we got to the clearing where we'd started the fort, it looked kind of sad, unfinished, just a pile of sticks and boards leaning against the trees. We ate lunch again out on the porch, and then, before I could really argue, Michael grabbed my hand and pulled me towards the woods. "Come on, Sarah, let's finish it today. It'll be awesome." My aunt came too, but she was mostly just supervising. This time, instead of staying near the edge of the woods, Michael wanted to go further in. He said he wanted to find bigger branches for the roof of the fort. We followed this little path, not really a path, more like a deer trail, I guess. It went down a little hill, deeper into the trees. The woods got thicker here, the trees closer together, blocking out more of the sunlight. It was starting to feel creepy. We got to this area where there were a lot of vines, thick, twisty vines hanging down from the trees. Michael loved climbing vines, so he immediately ran off to this big oak tree covered in them. I followed him, dragging my feet a little. My aunt was still behind us, not paying much attention, I don't think. Michael was already swinging on a vine, laughing, being all boyish. I was just standing there, looking around, and then I saw it. Off to my right, just beyond the vines, next to an old, broken-down fence post. Sitting there. Squatting, actually. Like it was sitting on its heels. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It was brown. That same dusty brown color I'd seen before. Furry. It was covered in fur or hair. It was hard to tell. It was hunched over, its back to us a little, but its head was turned, looking right at us. Right at me. I couldn't breathe. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. It looked man-like, but not quite. Its arms were too long, and its legs looked bent wrong. Its head was roundish, kind of hidden in the shadows of its fur. But its eyes, I could see its eyes. Dark, so dark they looked black, even in the shadows, and they were just staring at me, staring right through me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. It felt like forever, like I was trapped in a nightmare. Then, something broke inside me. A scream just ripped out of my throat, a high, thin, terrified scream. Michael stopped swinging on the vine, startled. He looked at me, confused, then followed my gaze. He saw it too. His face went white. He didn't scream, but I saw the fear in his eyes, wide and staring. I screamed again. "Run!" I yelled, and I didn't wait. I turned and ran as fast as I've ever run in my life. I could hear Michael pounding along behind me. I don't even know if my aunt saw it or understood what was happening, but she started running too, yelling something. We ran uphill, back towards the house. We didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't breathe until we burst out of the woods and into the backyard. We kept running until we were on the porch, collapsing against the railing, gasping for air. My grandma came running out of the house, looking terrified. "What happened? What's wrong?" she kept asking, but we couldn't even talk. We were just shaking and sobbing and trying to catch our breath. Finally, when I could speak a little, I just pointed back towards the woods. It was there, I choked out. The thing in the woods. My aunt, who was still white as a sheet, managed to explain a little better. She told my grandma we'd seen something in the woods, something strange, something she couldn't describe. Michael just nodded, his eyes still wide with terror. We never went back to the woods after that. Not that day, not ever again. The fort stayed unfinished. It probably rotted away years ago. I remember later that day, after we'd calmed down a little, I snuck a look back at the woods from my grandma's window. Just a quick peek, because I was still terrified of even looking in that direction. And I saw it, just for a second, standing at the edge of the woods where we'd been. It was standing up now, taller than it had been before, still brown, still furry, just standing there, watching the house. I slammed the curtain shut and ran away from the window. I didn't look back again. To this day, I have no idea what we saw. We never told anyone else about it, not really. My grandma just thought we'd gotten spooked by a deer or something. My aunt, I don't know what she thought. We never talked about it again. It was like we all just agreed to pretend it never happened. But I know what I saw. We both saw it. Michael too. I know it wasn't a deer, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't any animal I've ever seen or heard of. It was something else, something wrong. And sometimes late at night when it's really quiet, I still think about it. I still see those dark eyes staring at me, and I wonder, what was it? And is it still out there, in those woods, watching? I don't know. And I really don't want to find out. Story 9. Okay, so this happened years ago, like a long time, back when I was just a kid. We lived way out in the sticks, Michigan, middle of nowhere. 1960, yeah, that's right. Everything was different then. I was maybe 12, something like that, and every day, me and my sister and a bunch of kids from the neighborhood, we'd walk home from school together. It was the same old route every day, you know. Just a long, dusty gravel road stretching forever, deep ditches on either side, then just fields, kind of patchy and empty-looking. Nothing ever happened out there. That's the thing. It was boring. Which is why what we saw that day, well, it just flipped everything upside down. We were just walking, talking about school stuff, probably. Who knows, kid stuff. The sun was starting to go down, that kind of late afternoon light you get, that makes everything look a little longer and shadowy. And I don't know why, but something made me turn my head. Just a feeling, like when you know someone's watching you even if you can't see them. And that's when I saw it. At first, it was just movement down in the ditch on the side of the road, like something big moving fast through the weeds. I remember thinking, deer, but it felt wrong. Too heavy, too clumsy maybe. And then, whatever it was, it came up out of the ditch. I swear I froze, just stopped dead in my tracks. Everyone else kept walking for a second before they realized I wasn't with them anymore. This thing, it was huge. It was down on all fours when it came out of the ditch, like an animal. But then, as it got to the edge of the road, it just stood up. And I mean stood up tall. Way taller than any person. I couldn't even guess how tall, but it towered over the ditch, over the weeds, everything. It stood there for a second on two legs, and it just looked at us. I remember its whole body was covered in hair, thick, shaggy hair, kind of dark, but not black, more like dirty brown, maybe mixed with grey. It was everywhere, like a massive, hairy thing. I can't even describe the texture, just furry. Like nothing I'd ever seen. It moved out onto the road then, still standing. It wasn't walking exactly, more like lumbering, kind of heavy and powerful. It wasn't fast, not at first, but there was something about the way it moved that was unnerving. Like it could be fast if it wanted to. We were all just staring, nobody said a word. I don't even think we could breathe. It crossed the road and then it just jumped. There was another ditch on the other side of the road, and it just cleared it in one bound, like it wasn't even an obstacle, and it landed on the other side, still on two legs. Then there was this wooden fence, just a low fence, meant for keeping ponies in. It went right across the field on the other side of the road, and this thing, it didn't even slow down. It just stepped right over it, like it was nothing. The fence was probably chest high on me, but to this thing, it was like stepping over a twig. Once it was over the fence, it was in this big open field. I remember there were ponies in that field, just grazing, minding their own business. And as soon as this thing landed in the field. Those ponies just took off. They bolted like they'd seen a ghost. And this creature, it started to run too. And it was fast. Unbelievably fast. It was running on two legs now, and it was covering ground like crazy. Faster than those ponies, I swear. It was loping these huge strides, its arms swinging, just running away from the road towards the trees at the edge of the field. It disappeared into the woods after a few seconds, just gone. 1 minute it was there, this giant hairy thing running across the field, and then nothing, just empty field and running ponies. We stood there, on that gravel road, just staring at the spot where it vanished. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. It felt like we'd all just seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. Finally, my sister, she was a bit older than me, she whispered, What was that?" And honestly, I didn't have a clue. None of us did. We were just kids in the middle of nowhere. We didn't know about things like that. We just knew it was huge, hairy, and terrifying. We walked the rest of the way home in complete silence. Everyone was just shaken. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it again, standing in the trees, watching us. When I got home, I told my dad. He was sitting in his armchair, reading the newspaper, like always. I blurted it all out, stumbling over my words, trying to explain what we'd seen. About the giant hairy creature, the way it moved, how fast it was. He listened, kind of, but you could tell he wasn't really taking me seriously. He just kept reading his paper. When I finished, he put the paper down, looked at me with this patient look, like I was being silly. "Helena," he said, "it was probably just a bear, a big bear." "But Dad," I said, "it was on two legs. It was huge and hairy all over. Bears don't run like that." He just chuckled. "Honey, you were scared. You probably just saw a bear standing up on its hind legs. They do that sometimes." But I tried to argue, but he just cut me off. "We'll go look tomorrow," he said. "See if we can find any tracks, okay?" I knew it was no use arguing with him. He was a practical man, my dad. He didn't believe in unexplainable things. So the next morning before school, we went back to the spot on the road. My dad, he was looking for tracks, for bear tracks. But the ground there was all loose gravel and sandy soil, hard to see anything clear. We walked along the ditch, around the fence, even went into the edge of the field where the ponies were still grazing, looking a little skittish. But we didn't find anything. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing. My dad just shrugged. "See? Probably just a bear you imagined a little bigger than it was." And that was that. He dismissed it completely, said I had a vivid imagination, and for years that's what I told myself too, that it was just a bear, or maybe I'd imagined it, or just exaggerated it in my head. Kid's imagination, you know? That's what everyone said. And slowly, the memory started to fade a little, to get fuzzy around the edges. I still remembered it, of course, but it felt more like a weird dream than something that actually happened. Then, years later, like maybe 20 years after that day on the road, I was watching TV, just flipping channels, bored, and I stumbled on this show. It was about creatures, cryptids, they called them, strange animals that people had seen but scientists didn't recognize, and they were talking about Bigfoot. And suddenly it all came flooding back, like a dam bursting. Everything I'd pushed down, all the doubts and dismissals just vanished. They were showing pictures, artists' drawings, blurry photographs people claimed were Bigfoot. And it was like looking in a mirror. Not literally, of course, but it was the same. The descriptions, the size, the hair, the way it moved on two legs, the strength, the speed. It was exactly what I had seen, standing there on the side of that road all those years ago. Bigfoot. The word hit me like a shock. That's what it was. That's what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. And suddenly the fear came back too. Not just the immediate fear from that day, but a different kind of fear, a deeper, unsettling fear. Because if Bigfoot is real, then what else is out there? What else don't we know about? I still can't explain it. I replay that moment in my head all the time, seeing that thing emerge from the ditch, standing up tall, running across that field faster than ponies. It doesn't make sense. It defies everything I thought I knew about the world. And the worst part is, no one believes me. Not really. My dad's gone now, but even if he was still here, he'd probably still say it was a bear. And my sister, she remembers seeing something, but it's all faded for her too. Just a vague memory of something strange, nothing solid. But I know what I saw. I saw it with my own eyes. And it changed everything. It made me realize that there are things out there in the world that we don't understand. Things that are hidden, unknown, maybe even scary. And sometimes late at night when it's quiet, I still think about that creature, running through the field, disappearing into the woods. And I wonder, where did it go? Where did it come from? And is it still out there? And I have to be honest, I still get chills thinking about it. That feeling of utter disbelief, mixed with pure primal fear. It was just unreal. And I'll never ever forget it. Never. It's just, it was there. And then it wasn't. And no one saw it but us kids. And it just vanished. Into thin air. Or maybe into the woods. And that's it. That's all I know. And to this day, it still messes with my head. What was that thing? What did we really see? I'll probably never know for sure. And that's the scariest part of all. Story 10. Okay, so this happened years ago, like back in '97. Fall in the Upper Peninsula, you know how it gets. The leaves changing, everything turning those deep reds and oranges. Beautiful, right? But that year, something about it felt off. Not like spooky Halloween off, but like, underneath the pretty colors, something was watching. Maybe it was just me, but that's how it felt. Anyway, it was a regular Tuesday, I think. Maybe Wednesday. Doesn't matter, really. I was working over in Gladstone back then. Had to pick up the kids from daycare after. It was getting dark earlier then, fall and all, and the air had that real crisp bite to it. You know, the kind where you can smell the burning leaves in the distance, even if nobody's burning them right there. I got off work, rushed over to daycare, grabbed the kids, Sarah and little Mikey. Sarah was maybe 6, Mikey was 4, something like that. They were all hyped up as usual, daycare energy. We stopped at that little diner just outside of Gladstone on the way home. You know, the one with the neon sign that flickers half the time. Got them burgers and fries, the usual. They were chattering away in the back seat, making kid noises, fighting over ketchup packets, the normal stuff. Then we started heading towards Rapid River, that stretch of highway, the 4-lane before you get to the 2-lane split. That's where it happened. I was just driving, minding my own business. Windows were up because it was getting chilly but not too cold. Radio was probably on low, just some background noise. I always keep an eye on the road, I'm a pretty cautious driver. But you know how your eyes sometimes wander a little bit when you're on a long, straight road? That's what happened. Just a flick of my eyes to the side, towards the median strip between the lanes going opposite ways. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer. You see deer all the time up there, especially near the woods. But it wasn't moving like a deer. It was crouched down, like someone was hiding or maybe stalking something. It was over on the other side of the median, so across the lanes going the other way. I glanced at it again as I got a little closer, and then I saw it straighten up. And that's when my blood just ran cold. It was tall, really tall, way taller than a person. And it was brown. Not just brown like a deer, but the color of dead leaves, dried grass, earth. It blended in with the median strip perfectly. That's why I hadn't seen it sooner. It was just there, standing there in the middle of the highway median. It wasn't wearing clothes or anything. It was just itself. And it was staring straight ahead, like it was looking at something way off in the distance. It was still maybe a little crouched, but mostly upright. My heart started hammering in my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I wanted to say something to Sarah in the front seat. She was always looking out the window. but my voice just caught in my throat. I didn't want to scare her, or Mikey in the back. I told myself it was probably just someone in a costume playing a joke. Yeah, that had to be it. Some weirdo in a costume. Halloween was coming up, right? But even as I told myself that, I knew it wasn't true. It just didn't look like a costume. It looked real. Too real. The way it stood there, the way the brown color just seemed to be part of it, not something it was wearing. And the size of it, no way could that be a person in a suit. Then it moved. It wasn't like walking. It was more like unfolding itself. It took these massive steps, just a few of them, and in those steps it crossed both lanes of the highway. It was so fast, like it didn't even touch the ground properly. One moment it was standing in the median, and the next it was on the other side, heading towards the woods. It just vanished into the trees, poof, gone, like it was never there. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. I think I even stopped breathing for a second. Sarah looked over at me, her little face all scrunched up. "Mummy, are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah, honey, yeah," I managed to get out. My voice sounded shaky, even to my own ears. Just tired. Lame excuse, I know, but what was I supposed to say? Oh, I just saw some giant, freaky brown creature cross the highway in 3 impossible steps, no biggie. I kept driving. Faster than usual, I think. I kept looking in my rearview mirror, but there was nothing. Just the road stretching out behind me, empty, and the trees on either side, dark and silent. My mind was racing. What had I just seen? Seriously, what was that thing? It wasn't a bear. Bears aren't that tall, and they don't move like that. It wasn't a deer. Definitely not a deer. And it sure as hell wasn't a person. Unless people suddenly started growing to 10 feet tall and turning the color of dirt. I tried to rationalize it, to find some kind of explanation. Maybe it was my eyes playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired, like I told Sarah. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew I hadn't. I knew what I'd seen. And it had felt real. More real than anything else around me at that moment. We got home finally. I rushed the kids inside, locked the door behind us, and just stood there for a minute, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. The house felt safe, normal. The kids were already running off to play, yelling about cartoons or something. Everything was normal except what I knew I'd just seen. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I told my husband, Mark, about it. I tried to describe it as best as I could, the height, the color, the way it moved. He just listened, kind of nodding, but I could tell he didn't believe me. "Honey, maybe you were just tired," he said, the same thing I'd told Sarah. "You know, you work hard, taking care of the kids, everything. Maybe you just saw something in the shadows, and your mind filled in the rest." "No, Mark, it wasn't shadows," I insisted. "It was solid, real. I saw it clearly. It crossed the highway right in front of me." He just shrugged. "Maybe it was a bear," he said, "standing up on its hind legs. You know, they can do that." "It wasn't a bear," I said again, frustration rising in my voice. "It didn't look like a bear. It didn't move like a bear, and it was way too tall to be a bear." He didn't argue anymore. He just patted my hand and said, Okay, maybe it was. But you're safe now, right? We're home. Don't worry about it." But I did worry about it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that brown figure standing in the median, those long legs, the way it moved. It was burned into my brain. 2 days later, I was driving to work, listening to the radio like always. And then I heard it. The local station, WJPD or whatever it was called back then, they had a morning show with these 2 guys who joked around a lot. And they were talking about Bigfoot. I almost drove off the road. Apparently someone had called into the station saying they'd seen Bigfoot on the highway near Gladstone. I cranked up the radio, listening to every word. The DJ was laughing, making jokes. "Bigfoot in Gladstone?" he said in this exaggerated, funny voice. Yeah, right. And I saw Elvis driving a UFO down Main Street this morning. Come on, folks, seriously. He played some goofy sound effect of a howling ape or something. The other DJ laughed along with him. They totally dismissed the whole thing as a joke. They talked about it for maybe a minute, then moved on to the weather report. But I was frozen. Bigfoot. That's what it was. That's the only thing that made any kind of sense. A Bigfoot sighting. It sounded crazy, even to me. Bigfoot. Seriously, that's just a myth, right? A story people tell to scare kids around campfires. It's not real. It can't be real. But what else could it have been? What else could be that tall, that brown, that fast, and just disappear into the woods like that? And why would someone else call into the radio about seeing something similar in the same area around the same time? The logical part of my brain was screaming, no, it's not Bigfoot, that's ridiculous. But the other part, the part that had actually seen it, that part was whispering, maybe it is. I wanted to call the radio station. I wanted to tell them, hey, I saw something too. 2 nights ago, on the highway. It was real, I swear. I wanted to find the person who called in and talk to them, see if they saw the same thing I did. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was too scared. Scared of being laughed at. Scared of sounding crazy. Scared of confirming that I'd actually seen Bigfoot. So I stayed quiet. I didn't tell anyone else about it, not really. Just Mark, and he didn't believe me. And after the radio guys made fun of the Bigfoot report, I just shut up about it. I buried it inside. But I never forgot. Never. Every time I drive on that stretch of highway, especially at dusk, when the shadows get long and the trees start to look different, I remember it. I slow down a little, and I glance at the median strip, just for a second. Even though it's been years, even though it was probably nothing, maybe just my imagination, there's still a little part of me that wonders. What if it wasn't my imagination? What if it was real? What if that thing is still out there, somewhere in those woods, watching, waiting? I don't know. I still don't know what I saw that night. But I know what I felt, that cold, gripping fear, that feeling of wrongness. Like I'd glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see, something that shouldn't exist. And that feeling never really goes away. Even now, thinking about it, I get chills. Just remembering the way it stood there watching. I don't have any answers. I just have the memory. And the feeling that something strange and unexplained is out there, lurking just beyond the edge of what we know. And sometimes I think it's closer than we think. Story 11. It's taken me years to even think about writing this down, let alone talk about it. Even now, with the distance of time, my hands are actually shaking as I type. People tell me time heals everything, but some things just stick with you. They burrow under your skin and change the way you see everything. This is one of those things. It was October 1982. I was 17, and like most kids that age, I felt invincible. Dumb, right? You really think you've got the world figured out at 17. I lived in Cornell, a tiny town, you blink and you miss it, in Wisconsin. Back then, it was even smaller, if you can imagine. Everyone knew everyone. It was safe, or so we thought. That night, I was driving back from Watson. My boyfriend, Mark, lived out there with his folks on a farm. We'd gone to a movie in Chippewa Falls, a late show, and he'd ridden with me to Cornell earlier in the evening, and then I'd dropped him off back home. It was a Friday night, no school the next day, so even though it was late, probably pushing 11 p.m., my parents didn't make a fuss. They trusted me. Cornell was that kind of place. The drive between Cornell and Watson on County Road 426 is, well, it's rural. That's putting it mildly. Pitch black at night. No streetlights, no houses for miles sometimes, just woods and farmland. October in Wisconsin means it gets dark early, and by late night it's like being swallowed by black velvet. And cold. It was a crisp, cold night. The kind where you can see your breath even inside the car if you turn off the defroster. I was driving my dad's old Ford Pinto. It was a reliable car, if a little clunky, but I was grateful to have it. I remember the radio was playing some cheesy 80s love song. I probably had the windows up and the heater on low because of the chill. Just cruising, thinking about the movie, maybe thinking about Mark, just teenage stuff. County Road 426 is winding in parts, but mostly it's straight stretches punctuated by gentle curves. I was coming up to one of those gentler curves, not even really a curve, more like a slight bend in the road. My headlights were cutting through the darkness, doing their job. And that's when I saw it. At first, it just registered as something there, on the side of the road. My brain automatically categorized it as a person, a figure standing by the shoulder. My first thought, without even really thinking about it, was hitchhiker. You'd see them sometimes, even out in the sticks, though usually not this late. I slowed down a bit, naturally, not to stop, but just out of that automatic caution you have when you see someone on the side of the road at night. 30 miles per hour, maybe. I kept my eyes on the figure as I got closer, and that's when the first real jolt of wrongness hit me. It was tall, unnaturally tall, even standing on the side of the road, away from my car. It looked huge, like basketball player tall, maybe taller. And then I saw the arms. That's the detail that slammed into me and woke me up from the casual assumption that it was just some dude needing a ride. The arms were too long, way too long. They hung down past its knees. That's not normal. Not human normal, anyway. A shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't a comfortable shiver. It was that ice water in your veins kind of shiver. Suddenly, the cheesy love song on the radio sounded grating. The darkness outside the car seemed to press in closer. As I got closer, the details started to resolve. And the hitchhiker idea, that evaporated instantly. This wasn't a person, not like any person I'd ever seen. It was massive, taller than I first thought, probably 8-9 feet tall, covered in black hair. Not like animal fur, but thick, matted black hair, all over it. It looked oily, almost. Not shiny, but slick-looking. The kind of black that sucks in the light, makes things look deeper blacker than black. Like a void. I could see the shape of it better now. It was vaguely humanoid, standing upright, but wrong. The proportions were all off. The shoulders were broad, incredibly broad, but slumped forward. The chest was huge, barrel-like, and those arms, they just kept hanging down, long and thick as tree trunks. Its skin, I could only see bits of it underneath the hair, looked grey, charcoal grey, like ash. It wasn't smooth skin either. It looked crinkled, old, like elephant hide. The face, that's what really messed with me. From a distance, it was just a grey blob in the black hair, but as I got within maybe 50 feet, I could make out features. And they were almost human, but so far off. It had a face, roughly in the right place, 2 eyes, a nose-ish thing, a mouth. But everything was distorted, like it had been assembled wrong. The face was flat, the nose just 2 slits, and the mouth, it was a gash, a wide, lipless slash in that grey skin. And the eyes, oh God, the eyes. They were the worst part. Even in the dark, in the headlights, they shone, not like animal eyes reflect light. This was different. They glowed, a deep blood red, not a bright, cheerful red, more like arterial blood, dark, thick, horrifying red. They were fixed on me, staring right at me, and that's when it hit me, full force terror, not just being scared, but utter primal terror, the kind that makes your heart hammer against your ribs, your breath catch in your throat, your muscles lock up. In those eyes, I didn't see anything human, or even animal in the way I understood animals. There was something else, something ancient, something hungry and terrified. That was the strangest part. It wasn't just aggression. It was scared too, as scared as I was, maybe more. We locked eyes for what felt like forever. But it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. 7 seconds, maybe. 7 seconds of absolute frozen horror. 7 seconds where my brain was screaming at me to do something, anything, but my body was just a statue, locked in place, steering the car straight towards that thing. Then in a flash it was gone. 1 second those red eyes were burning into me. That monstrous figure was looming on the side of the road. The next, nothing. It was just gone, like it had vanished into thin air, except it didn't vanish into thin air. It moved so fast, so incredibly fast. It didn't run, it didn't walk. It was more like a leap, one single enormous leap. It just propelled itself off the ground and launched itself into the darkness, into the swamp. To the left of the road, there was just a stretch of low, marshy land, thick with cattails and scrubby trees. It was dark even without this thing blocking the headlights. But that's where it went. One moment it was there, then in a blink it was airborne, a dark shape hurtling impossibly fast, and then gone into the blackness of the swamp. The whole thing, from when I first really saw it properly to when it disappeared, couldn't have been more than 10 seconds, maybe less. But in those 10 seconds, my whole world shifted. As soon as it was gone, the paralysis broke. My foot slammed down on the accelerator without me even thinking. The Pinto roared and jumped forward. Tires spitting gravel, I was out of there. I didn't look back. Not once. I just floored it. 60, 70, 80 miles per hour on that narrow country road, the speedometer needle bouncing wildly. I didn't care about the speed limit. I didn't care about anything except getting away. The radio was still playing that stupid love song. I don't even remember what song it was now, but I remember how jarring it sounded, how completely out of place it was, with the terror still clawing at my insides. I reached out and just slammed the off button. Silence filled the car, broken only by the roar of the engine and my own ragged breathing. I kept driving, faster than I should have. My hands were clenched white-knuckle on the steering wheel. My eyes were wide, darting between the road ahead and the rear-view mirror, even though I knew it wasn't going to be back there. It was gone, into the swamp. But still, that fear. It was like a physical weight in my chest. I didn't slow down until I was back on the main highway, Route 29. The familiar lights of Cornell were finally visible in the distance. Streetlights, houses, normal things, things that felt so blessedly, unbelievably normal. I pulled into my driveway and cut the engine. The silence in the car was suddenly different. Not the oppressive silence of the dark country road, but just silence. The engine ticked as it cooled down. I sat there for a minute, just breathing, trying to get my heart to slow down. My parents were still up. The porch light was on. When I walked in, they were in the living room, reading. They looked up, surprised to see me back so soon. "Everything all right, honey?" my mom asked. "You're back early." "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice sounding shaky even to my own ears. "Just tired." I didn't tell them anything. Not then, not ever. How do you explain something like that? How do you say, "Yeah, I just saw a monster on the side of the road, 8 feet tall, covered in black hair with red glowing eyes"? They'd have thought I was crazy or on drugs, and I wouldn't blame them. I went straight to bed. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling. Sleep was impossible. My mind kept replaying those few seconds over and over again. The figure, the arms, the face, those eyes, those horrifying red eyes. I kept thinking about the speed, the way it moved, that single impossible leap. It defied physics. It defied everything I knew about the world. And the fear. That's what stayed with me the most. That raw animal fear. I'd never felt anything like it before, and I haven't since. It's a different kind of fear than being scared by a horror movie or hearing a noise in the dark. This was real, visceral. the fear of being prey. The next day, Saturday, I drove back out to County Road 426. During the day, in the sunlight, it looked so ordinary, just a normal country road, trees, fields, blue sky. I drove to the curve where it happened. I slowed down, heart starting to pound again, even in broad daylight. I stopped the car and got out. My legs felt shaky. I looked around, just the side of the road. Gravel shoulder, a few weeds. Across the road, a cornfield, harvested now, just stalks left standing. And to the left, the swamp. It looked different in the daylight, less menacing maybe, but still dark, still thick and impenetrable. I walked to the edge of the ditch that ran alongside the road, separating it from the swamp. I peered into the tall grass and cattails. Nothing. Of course, nothing. What did I expect to find? Footprints the size of dinner plates? Tufts of black hair snagged on the bushes? No, there was nothing, just mud and swamp grass and the rustling of leaves in the autumn wind. I stood there for a long time, scanning the swamp, searching for something, anything. Some sign that what I'd seen wasn't just a hallucination, a trick of the dark, a product of my overactive teenage imagination. But there was nothing. Finally, I gave up, got back in the car and drove home. The fear hadn't gone away, but it had changed. It was less raw, less immediate, but it was still there, lurking underneath. A cold knot in my stomach, a seed of doubt planted in my mind. For years after that, I avoided driving County Road 426 at night. If I had to go to Watson, I'd take the highway, even if it was longer. And even on the highway, even years later, I'd find myself glancing into the darkness at the side of the road, half expecting to see those red eyes glowing in the shadows. I've tried to rationalize it. I've tried to tell myself it was a bear, a really big bear, standing on its hind legs. But bears don't have red eyes, and bears don't move like that, and bears don't stand 8 feet tall with arms that drag on the ground, or a person, someone in a costume, a prank. But who would be out there in the middle of nowhere dressed like that? And why? And how could someone move so fast, leap so far? No, none of the explanations fit, none of them even come close. What I saw that night on County Road 426 wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else entirely. Something other. Something that shouldn't exist. But I saw it. I saw it with my own eyes. And I know what I saw. Even if no one else ever believes me. To this day I can still picture it. The black hair, the grey face, those eyes. Those terrifying red eyes, and the fear, that gut-wrenching primal fear. It's still there, just beneath the surface, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when it's dark and quiet, I find myself looking out the window, into the darkness, just for a second, just to make sure, because out there in the dark, in the places we don't understand, I know there are things that exist that we can't explain, things that are real, things that are terrifying, and sometimes they look back. Story 12. Okay, so this is still messed up to talk about, even after all this time. It was the summer of '09, man, summer after high school. You know that feeling of everything being open in front of you and absolutely nothing really mattering at the same time. That was exactly it. I was supposed to be heading up to Mullet Lake to meet my mum's side of the family. Annual thing. I usually hated it, all the little kids running around and the old aunts pinching your cheeks, but that summer, it was different. I just wanted to get away, get out of town, and honestly, just drive. I was cruising up I-75, windows down, music blasting, something dumb like Blink-182 probably, because that was my headspace back then. Just zoning out, enjoying the sunshine and the feeling of the road. I remember it was hot, like really hot, even with the windows down, the kind of heat that makes the air thick and kind of shimmery looking above the asphalt. Then, boom, traffic, out of nowhere. Just a wall of brake lights ahead. I groaned, naturally. Everyone does. Started slowing down, thinking it was probably just some idiot causing trouble, or maybe a deer crossing the highway or something. Michigan, you know. Always something. But as I got closer, it got weirder. It wasn't just a slowdown. It was a full stop, and not like your typical highway stop and go. Everyone was pulled way over to the shoulder, not even in the lanes anymore, like something was seriously blocking the road ahead. I eased my car onto the shoulder too, engine idling, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. My first thought was accident, maybe a really bad one, but there were no cops, no sirens, no flashing lights, nothing. Just cars parked on the side of the highway, all facing the same direction, towards the woods on the right. That's when I noticed everyone was out of their cars, standing by their hoods or leaning on their doors, staring. Just staring. And they weren't talking. That was the freaky part. Usually when there's a traffic jam, people are honking, yelling, getting all stressed out. You know the drill. But this was silent. Eerily silent, except for the cicadas buzzing like crazy in the trees. I switched off the engine, figuring I should at least see what everyone was gawking at. Got out of the car and joined the edge of the little crowd, feeling this weird knot in my stomach already. It was like everyone was collectively holding their breath. Then I looked where they were looking, into the trees, off the side of the highway. Just woods, Michigan woods, pine trees mostly. Some scrub brush, nothing unusual. For a second I was like, what the heck are these people staring at? Is there a bear or something? Because you do see bears sometimes around there. And then I saw it. It was moving. Deep in the trees, but definitely moving. Something big, dark. It was hard to make out clearly at first because of the trees and shadows, but it was clearly breaking branches, pushing through the undergrowth. Making a lot of noise, actually, not like a deer or anything skittish, more like something powerful. People started murmuring then, quiet whispers. What is that? Is that a bear? Holy crap! It kept moving closer to the edge of the woods, towards the highway, and as it got closer, it got clearer, and the bear idea, that went out the window fast. This thing was huge. Like ridiculously huge. And it wasn't a bear, not even close. It was dark, covered in thick, matted fur, almost black. And it was tall. Even moving on all fours, it was taller than any bear I'd ever seen, easily. More like car height. I know it sounds crazy. Then it stepped out of the trees fully, into a small clearing right by the side of the highway, and that's when everyone went dead silent again. Because in that moment, whatever we thought we were seeing got turned on its head. It wasn't on all fours anymore. It stood up, slowly, deliberately, like it was stretching or just deciding to see what was what, and it just kept going up, and up, and up. It stood on two legs, man, two legs like a person, but way, way bigger, taller than any person could ever be. 7, 8 feet tall. Easy, maybe more. I'm terrible at judging distances and heights, but it was huge, towering. And it wasn't shaped like a bear standing up either. It was different, more hunched over, even standing upright. Thick arms, hanging down, almost to its knees. Hands, but not human hands. More like paws, with knuckles that dragged on the ground when it was moving on all fours. Someone near me actually gasped, like a sharp intake of breath. And I think I did too. My heart started hammering in my chest, like it wanted to jump right out. Fear, real primal fear, just punched me in the gut. It was covered in that dark, shaggy fur. Its face was mostly hidden by the fur, but I could see a broad, flat nose, kind of like a gorilla, now that I think about it. Big, heavy brow ridges, and small, dark eyes that seemed to just stare straight ahead. Not at us, not really at anything in particular, just forward. It was like a gorilla, yeah, that's the closest thing my brain could latch onto, but way, way bigger, and way scarier. This wasn't some zoo animal escaped. This felt wrong. Wrong in a way I couldn't even put into words. It just stood there, on the side of the highway, for what felt like forever. Maybe only a minute or two, but time just stretched out. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, just this thing standing there, massive and dark against the green trees and blue sky, like it was totally out of place, but also like it owned the place, like it belonged there, and we were the ones who didn't. Then, just as slowly and deliberately as it had stood up, it started to move. And it didn't just go back into the woods. It moved towards the highway, towards us. Not aggressively, not running, just walking, ambling almost. But it was coming right towards the lanes of traffic. That's when the panic really started to set in. People started backing away from the edge of the shoulder, inching back towards their cars. Still silent, though, like we were all afraid to make a sound, afraid to attract its attention, even though it didn't seem to be paying us any attention at all. It stepped onto the asphalt of the shoulder, heavy footfalls, surprisingly quiet on the road surface. And then, without even breaking stride, it just crossed the highway, right across the lanes of I-75, like it was a deer crossing or a raccoon or something totally mundane, but it was this giant, monstrous thing. It just walked right across. 2 lanes of highway, then the median, then 2 more lanes on the other side. Cars were backed up on the other side of the highway too, I saw now, stopped just as abruptly as we were. They were staring too. Of course they were. And as it crossed, I got a better look at it from the side, and it was even more off. Its fur was thick, matted, almost greasy-looking. It moved with a weird, rolling gait, like its muscles were all wrong somehow. And its back was humped, slightly deformed-looking. Not like a natural hump, more like something broken and healed wrong. It reached the other side of the highway, stepped off the asphalt, and walked straight into the woods on the other side. Just disappeared into the trees. Just gone. Just like that. And then silence. Again. Except this time, it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the stunned silence of the initial shock. This was more confused, disbelieving, like everyone was waiting for someone else to say something, to explain what we'd all just seen. I looked around at the faces of the other drivers, and everyone was in the same state of shock. Pale, eyes wide, jaws slack. Some people were shaking their heads like they were trying to shake the image out of their brains. Others were just staring blankly ahead, into the woods where the thing had disappeared. A guy in a pickup truck near me finally spoke, his voice cracking. Did anyone else just see that? And then it was like a dam broke. Everyone started talking at once, voices hushed and nervous, asking the same questions. What was that? Did you see that thing? Was that a... Nobody could even finish the sentence. Nobody wanted to say it out loud. I heard someone say bear again, hesitantly, like they desperately wanted it to be a bear, even though we all knew, deep down, it wasn't. It couldn't be, but what else could it be? Nobody had an answer. Nobody had any explanation. We all just stood there by the side of the highway, exchanging these bewildered, scared looks, this unspoken agreement that we'd all seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. Slowly, hesitantly, people started getting back into their cars, like waking up from a nightmare, trying to get back to normal life. Engines started, doors slammed. People started pulling back onto the highway, cautiously at first, then picking up speed, desperate to put distance between themselves and that stretch of woods. I got back in my car too, still shaking. Hands clammy on the steering wheel. My heart was still pounding in my ears. I couldn't even remember what song was playing on the radio anymore. Everything just felt different. The sunshine didn't feel as bright. The air felt heavier. The whole world just seemed a little bit off-kilter. I drove on towards Mullet Lake, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, trying to find a logical explanation. Bear? No way. Gorilla? In Michigan? Impossible. Some kind of elaborate hoax. But for who and how? And it felt too real, too solid, too terrifying. By the time I got to the lake, I was still completely rattled. My family was already there, of course, grilling burgers, laughing, kids screaming and splashing in the lake. Everything normal, happy, summer vacation. The exact opposite of what I was feeling. My mom saw me pull up, waved, smiling. "Ian, you made it. What took you so long?" I tried to smile back, but it probably looked weird and strained. "Traffic," I said, my voice sounding kind of flat, even to my own ears. "Yeah, bad traffic." Later, after dinner, when everyone was sitting around the bonfire telling stories, I finally decided to bring it up. I figured maybe if I talked about it, it would somehow make more sense, or at least feel less crazy. I started slowly, hesitantly. "You guys won't believe what happened to me on the way here." Everyone turned to look at me, curious. My younger cousins especially always loved stories. "What? Car accident?" my uncle asked, concerned. No accident, but I saw something. On the highway. Stopped in traffic." "Yeah? What?" one of my cousins asked, bouncing with impatience. I took a deep breath and just told them. About the traffic jam, the people staring into the woods, the noise in the trees. And then, the thing. The giant, dark, hairy thing that walked on two legs, that crossed the highway and disappeared into the woods. I described it as best as I could, the size, the fur, the way it moved, the fear. I tried to make them understand how real it felt, how unbelievable it was. And they laughed. Not mean laughter, not really. More like disbelief laughter. Confused amusement. My cousins started giggling. My aunts exchanged knowing glances. Even my mom chuckled a little. "Oh, Ian," my mom said, smiling. "You've been driving too long. You're seeing things." "No, Mom, seriously. I'm not kidding. Everyone else saw it too. Dozens of cars pulled over, people out looking. Everyone saw the same thing." "Sure they did," my uncle said, patting me on the shoulder, a big grin on his face. "Bigfoot crossed I-75, huh? Right in broad daylight?" The laughter got a little louder. More jokes followed. Bigfoot sightings, swamp gas, too much sun. They thought I was kidding, or exaggerating, or just plain crazy. I tried to argue, tried to explain again, but it was pointless. They just wouldn't believe me. It was too far-fetched, too unbelievable. Bigfoot stories were campfire tales, silly jokes. Not real life, not something you saw on the side of a highway in Michigan in 2009. I just gave up. I stopped talking, let them laugh. What else could I do? How do you explain something like that to people who are determined not to believe you? I sat there by the fire, feeling more alone than ever, staring into the flames, seeing that dark, massive shape flicker in the burning wood. And the laughter and jokes of my family just faded into background noise. They were in their world, and I was somewhere else, somewhere in the woods on I-75, with that thing. To this day, I can't explain it. I don't know what I saw. I don't know if anyone else who was there that day ever figured it out either. Maybe they went home and told their stories and got laughed at too. Or maybe they just buried it deep down, tried to forget it ever happened, pretended it was just the heat, or their imagination playing tricks on them. But I know what I saw. I felt the fear. I felt the cold, hard reality of something else, something that shouldn't be. And sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still think about it. About that creature standing there in the woods, watching the highway, and I wonder, what was it? Where did it come from? And is it still out there? I haven't driven on I-75 north past Wolverine since. Not on purpose anyway. And I probably never will again. There are some things you just don't need to see twice, and some questions you are better off not having answers to. Some things are just out there, unexplained. And maybe that's the way it should stay. Story 13. Okay, so this is gonna sound completely insane, I know. And honestly, even now, years later, talking about it still makes my skin crawl. It was back in 2008, September to be exact. Michigan, out in the sticks, near Ashley if anyone knows the area. Small towns, cornfields for days, woods thick and dark, hunting season, specifically the youth deer hunt weekend. I was 15, my buddy Matt was too, and we were out with our rifles, all excited to finally be doing a real hunt. We were out near my uncle's land, which is mostly fields bordered by woods. Dusk was setting in, that kind of quiet, hazy twilight you get in the fall, and we were just about calling it quits for the evening. We hadn't seen anything worth shooting at, mostly squirrels and rabbits. We were walking along the edge of a cornfield. The stalks were taller than us, dry and rustling a little in the breeze. Just that typical cornfield sound, you know. Nothing to write home about. I was scanning the field, trying to see if any deer might be poking out at the edge, when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow playing tricks, maybe the light through the trees. But it moved. It was right at the edge of the woods, where the cornfield met the trees, in that kind of in-between zone where it's always a little darker. I stopped dead in my tracks, rifle raised almost without thinking, and squinted. "Matt," I whispered, nudging him with my elbow. "Look, over there." He followed my gaze, his eyes narrowed. For a second, we both just stared. It was tall, really tall, taller than any person, definitely taller than any deer, and there's no other way to describe it, it looked almost silver, or grayish silver, like metal, but not shiny metal. Duller, like brushed steel maybe, and it was moving. I brought my rifle up, the scope coming to my eye. It's just a cheap 4X scope, nothing fancy, but it was enough to zoom in. And that's when I saw it clearly. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I could even begin to understand. It was shaped kind of like a gorilla, but upright, really upright, and huge. Massive shoulders, long arms, but it was standing straight up like a man. And the color, that silver gray. It covered its whole body, like fur, but not fur, more metallic looking. It's hard to explain. Matt was looking through his scope too. I could hear him breathing heavier next to me. I don't think either of us said anything for a solid minute. We were just frozen, staring at this thing. It was standing at the edge of the corn, partly in shadow, partly in the fading light. Just there, in the middle of nowhere, Michigan. It was facing away from us, towards the cornfield, maybe looking for something to eat, I don't know. It was just still. Except it wasn't completely still. It was swaying slightly, like it was breathing, or maybe just shifting its weight. But there was no sound. That's what got me right away. No sound at all. We were standing on dry leaves. Everything crunches under your boots out there, especially in September. And this thing was huge. I mean, seriously big. If it was a deer, you'd hear it breathing. You'd hear it shifting. You'd definitely hear it if it stepped on any dry leaves. But there was nothing. Just the cornfield rustling a little in the breeze and the crickets starting to chirp. And this giant silver thing standing there silently. Then it turned its head, slowly, like it sensed us, even though we hadn't made a sound ourselves. Its head turned towards us, but I couldn't see its face clearly. It was still partly in shadow, and the scope wasn't great in the low light, but I could tell it was looking right at us. I could feel it. And then, in a blink, it was gone. I mean, literally gone. 1 second it was there, this massive impossible thing, and the next, empty woods. It didn't run. It didn't crash through the underbrush. It just vanished, like it was never there at all. Matt lowered his rifle first. He was pale. I could see it even in the fading light. Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice shaky. "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper myself. My heart was pounding in my chest like crazy. "Yeah, I saw it." What was that?" He looked at me, eyes wide, completely freaked out. I shook my head. "I have no idea. I don't know." And I really didn't. I'd never seen anything like it, never even heard stories about anything like it. It was like something out of a really bad dream. We just stood there for another minute, maybe longer, staring at the woods where it had been, both of us rifles still in our hands but completely forgotten. The silence felt different now, heavier, more charged, like something was still watching us from the trees. Then a memory flashed in my head. It was earlier that summer. I was riding my horse, Duke, along the same fields, just a casual ride, nothing special, and we got to this same cornfield right at the edge of these same woods, and Duke just stopped, dead stopped, wouldn't move. He's normally a pretty chill horse, not easily spooked, but he planted his feet and refused to go any closer to the cornfield. I tried to urge him forward, nudged him with my heels, even a little tap with the reins, but nothing. He just stood there, ears pricked, nostrils flared, staring at the cornfield like he'd seen a ghost. He was breathing hard, tense as a wire. I could feel him trembling under me. I looked, tried to see what was bothering him, but I didn't see anything, just corn and woods. Finally, I gave up and turned him around, rode back home. He was fine once we were away from the cornfield, back to his normal, calm self. But now, standing there with Matt, seeing that thing, it clicked. That's why Duke had freaked out. He'd sensed something that was in or near that cornfield. And I'd just brushed it off as him being weird that day. "Matt," I said, my voice still quiet, "remember when Duke wouldn't go near this cornfield back in the summer, like totally freaked out?" He frowned, thinking. Yeah, I remember you telling me about that." Said he just froze up. "Yeah, well, I think he saw something, or sensed something." I gestured towards the woods. "Something, like that." He looked at the woods again, then back at me. You think that thing was here all summer?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe it just showed up." The idea of that thing being out there in the woods near my house all summer, it was deeply unsettling. We didn't say much more after that. We were both too freaked out to talk. We just slowly backed away from the cornfield, keeping our eyes on the woods. We turned around and started walking back towards the path that led to my uncle's cabin, where we were staying. The woods seemed different now. Every shadow looked like it could be that thing. Every rustle of leaves sounded like it might be moving, silently, watching us. The feeling of being watched was intense. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, expecting to see it standing there at the edge of the trees, those silver eyes, if it even had eyes like normal creatures, watching us go. We walked faster than we had before, almost jogging for a while, just wanting to get out of the woods and back to the cabin. The light was fading fast now, proper dark was coming, and the thought of being out there in the dark with whatever that thing was, it was terrifying. When we finally broke out of the trees and onto the dirt path, we practically ran the rest of the way to the cabin. We slammed the door behind us and stood there for a minute, breathing hard, just inside. Safe, sort of. My uncle wasn't there yet. He was still at work, so it was just us. We turned on all the lights, even though it wasn't fully dark yet, just to make it feel less exposed. We grabbed sodas from the fridge and sat down at the kitchen table, not saying anything for a long time. Finally, Matt broke the silence. "Dude, what do you think it was?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I honestly have no freaking idea. Some kind of animal, but silver, and that's silent, and so tall. It's like nothing I've ever heard of." We started trying to rationalize it, to make sense of it somehow. Maybe it was a bear. But bears aren't silver, and they aren't silent, especially not big ones moving through dry leaves. And the shape wasn't right. It was too upright, too human-like, but not human. We talked about Bigfoot, but that's supposed to be hairy, brown or reddish, not silver and metallic. And again, not usually completely silent. We went through all the animals we could think of, anything that even remotely fit the description. Mountain lions, too small. Wolves, wrong shape, wrong color. Nothing even came close. We were just drawing blanks. It was like our brains were refusing to process what we'd actually seen because it was so impossible. We didn't tell my uncle when he got back later that evening. We just couldn't. It sounded too crazy. He would have laughed us out of the room, told us we were seeing things, maybe got into the deer scent spray or something stupid like that. We just pretended like it was a normal, uneventful hunt, said we hadn't seen any deer. But we barely slept that night. We were both on the top bunks in the small bedroom, just staring at the ceiling, listening to every little creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside. Every shadow in the window looked like that silver shape. We kept whispering to each other in the dark, going over what we'd seen again and again, trying to figure it out, and always coming back to the same point. We had no idea. The next morning we were both still shaken. The woods just seemed different, like they held a secret, a dangerous secret, that we'd accidentally stumbled upon. We finished out the youth hunt, went back out into the woods, but we stayed far away from that cornfield. We hunted in other areas, tried to act normal, but it wasn't the same. The excitement, the fun of the hunt was gone, replaced by this lingering unease, this constant feeling that something was watching, something we didn't understand and didn't want to encounter again. We went home that Sunday, and I don't think either of us really talked about it much after that, at least not directly. It became this unspoken thing, this shared secret, this memory we both had but couldn't really explain or make sense of, but I never forgot it, never will. Every time I drive past cornfields now, especially at dusk, I get a shiver down my spine. I think about that silver thing, standing there silently in the fading light, and I think about Duke and how he knew something was wrong before I did. I still go hunting sometimes, out in Michigan, but I avoid that area now. I don't go near those woods. And I definitely don't go anywhere near any cornfields at dusk. Some things you just can't unsee, can't unfeel, and that silver thing in the cornfield, that's one of them. I don't know what it was, and I'm never going to know, and honestly, maybe it's better that way. Some things are just out there, beyond explanation, beyond anything we understand, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones that stay that way, unexplained and just out there, still, watching. Maybe even now. I still get chills thinking about it, just thinking about it, and knowing that somewhere out there in those woods, something like that exists. It just messes with your head, you know. It makes you wonder what else is out there that we don't see, that we don't know about. And maybe we're better off not knowing. And due to Story 14. Look, I don't usually talk about this stuff, especially not out loud. My buddies down at the bait shop, they rib me enough about the gators getting smarter, you know, joking about them reading maps and showing up at your doorstep for dinner. They wouldn't believe this for a second, and frankly, sometimes I barely believe it myself. But I need to get this out there, somewhere, to someone. Maybe just putting it into words will help me make some sense of it, even if it's years later and the stink of the swamp still feels like it's stuck to my skin. It was October. Middle of October. Perfect time for hog hunting. Crisp air starting to roll in at night, but still muggy enough in the daytime to keep you sweating even if you were just standing still. Backwater swamp. I know it like the back of my hand. Been hunting there since I was a kid, following my old man around, learning the trails, learning the sounds, learning when to listen and when to run. People around these parts, they give backwater a wide berth. Too easy to get turned around in there. Too many critters that can turn your day upside down real quick. But I like it. It's raw, it's wild, and it's usually got what I'm looking for. Hogs in backwater are big and mean, and that's what I was after. I hiked in early afternoon. Sun was still high and beating down, sweat already soaking through my shirt. The air in the swamp is heavy, always thick, smells like damp earth and decaying leaves, a little sour and musky all at once. I set up my stand. Nothing fancy, just a portable climber, strapped it to a sturdy pine right on the edge of a clearing. The clearing itself was swampy. Tall grass, some cattails, water pooled in patches here and there, reflecting the sky in murky, broken pieces. Hog sign everywhere, rooting marks, wallows, even a few trails cut through the brush. It was a good spot. I got myself settled in, checked my rifle. A good old .30-06 never let me down. Loaded, safety on, leaning against the tree next to me. Pulled out my water, took a swig, started scanning the tree line. Afternoon in the swamp is usually pretty noisy. Birds chirping, insects buzzing, frogs croaking. Sometimes you hear a gator bellowing way off in the distance. But as the sun started to dip, things got quieter. Not just quieter like daytime noises fading, but a different kind of quiet. A hush. Like everything else in the swamp was holding its breath. The chirping stopped first. Then the buzzing seemed to fade. Even the frogs went silent. Just still. That kind of quiet makes the hair on the back of your neck prickle up, you know. It wasn't natural. I've spent countless hours in the woods. Silence is normal, but this wasn't normal silence. This felt expectant. I shifted in my stand, tried to shake it off. Probably just the usual evening lull. Sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the clearing, turning the water black in the shade. Golden light still touched the tops of the trees, but down in the swamp, it was already getting dim. I could feel the temperature dropping a little, that cool, damp air settling in. Then I heard it. It started low, a rumble deep in the woods behind me. At first I thought maybe thunder, distant thunder. But the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight, and this sound wasn't thunder. It was guttural, deep, throaty, like something massive was trying to clear its lungs, but instead of coughing, it was roaring. But not a lion roar, not a bear roar. Something different, something wrong. It was a growl, but stretched out, elongated, almost like a howl, but from the gut. A guttural, drawn-out, animalistic thing. It vibrated through the air. You could feel it in your chest, in your bones. It was low frequency, but it was loud, booming, echoing through the trees, even though it seemed like it was coming from deep in the thick stuff. My heart hammered against my ribs. Adrenaline jolted through me, cold and sharp. I gripped my rifle tighter, my knuckles white. What the hell was that? I've heard bear, I've heard panther, even heard wolves once way up north. This was none of those. This was something else. The silence rushed back in after the sound faded, but it was even heavier now, charged. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, could hear my own breathing getting ragged. I told myself it was probably just a big gator, maybe something hurt, bellowing in pain. Yeah, that's it. A gator. But even as I said it to myself, I knew it was bullshit. Gators don't sound like that. Then the deer bolted. They were there, in the edge of the clearing, 5, 6 of them, dozen fawns, just grazing, completely relaxed a few minutes before. Now suddenly they were gone. 1 second they were there, heads down, munching on grass. The next, they exploded. Not just spooked, panicked. They crashed through the underbrush, tails, white flags flashing in the dim light, disappearing into the thick woods like they were being chased by demons. The noise they made crashing away was almost as startling as that growl. Deer in backwater swamp are used to predators. They live with gators, with bobcats, sometimes with black bears. They spook, sure, but they usually don't freak out like that unless it's something seriously bad, something really, really dangerous. And whatever was making that sound, it had them running for their lives. That was it for me. Hog hunting was over. Survival mode kicked in. Whatever was making that sound, whatever scared the deer that badly, I did not want to be around when it got closer. And I had a feeling it was getting closer. I unstrapped my climber quick as I could, packed it up, slung it over my shoulder. Rifle in hand, safety off now, finger on the trigger. Every muscle in my body was tense, wired, ready to run, ready to fight, ready to do whatever it took to get the hell out of there. I started moving, heading back the way I came, trying to keep quiet but moving fast. The woods were getting darker, twilight was fading fast, and the swamp sounds were starting to come back, tentatively at first. A frog croaking, an insect buzzing, like they were testing the waters, seeing if it was safe to come out again. But underneath it all, that silence was still there, heavy, oppressive, waiting. Then I heard it again, closer this time, much closer, the same guttural growl, but louder, clearer, no mistaking what it was now. It was a warning, a challenge. It was coming from the woods behind me, the same direction I'd heard it before, but it was definitely closer, maybe half the distance. Whatever it was moving my way, and it was moving fast. I didn't run, not yet. Running in the swamp in the dark is a good way to break an ankle, or worse. But I picked up my pace, walking as fast as I could, weaving through the trees, trying to keep to the game trails, watching every shadow, listening to every rustle of leaves. And then, from ahead of me, from the direction I was heading, came another sound. This one was different, higher pitched, still guttural but sharper, more piercing, like a howl but broken, ragged, edged with something feral. It answered the first sound, echoing through the swamp, and in that moment I realized I was surrounded. They were in front of me and behind me. Whatever they were, and they were communicating. Those sounds weren't random animal noises. They were talking to each other. Panic hit me then, cold and visceral, real bone-deep terror. My breath hitched in my throat, my legs turned to lead. I stopped dead in my tracks, rifle shaking in my hands. Trapped. I was trapped. The howl from ahead came again, closer this time, and then the growl from behind answered, closer too. They were closing in, from both sides, like they were herding me, like they were hunting me. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, so loud I thought they could hear it too. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. My mouth was dry, tasted like metal, and then I smelled it. Along with the damp earth and the rotting leaves, something else, something acrid, musky, foul, like wet fur but ranker, mixed with something else, something almost chemical, a putrid, sickening stench that hit you in the back of your throat and made your stomach churn. It was thick in the air, heavy, like a fog you could taste. The smell came from in front of me, carried on the breeze from the direction of the howling sound. It was close, too close. I knew I had to move. Staying there was suicide. But which way? Backwards, towards the growling thing behind me. Forwards, towards the howling, stinking thing in front of me. Neither option felt good. Neither option felt safe. Then I remembered the water. The swamp was all around me. Water pooled everywhere, ditches, creeks, ponds, the main channel further out, but still, water. Gators, sure, snakes, probably. But better that than whatever the hell was in the woods. Without thinking, without planning, I turned, crashed through the brush to my left, stumbling, falling, scrambling down the bank into the black, murky water. It was cold. Shockingly cold, the sudden chill hitting me like a physical blow. It stank of mud and stagnant water, thick with weeds and lily pads, and God knows what else. I plunged in, waist deep at first, then chest deep, water sucking at my boots, pulling me down. I waded, splashing, stumbling forward, deeper and deeper into the swamp. The water closed around me, up to my neck now, icy, black, reflecting nothing but the darkness overhead. I kept moving, pushing through the weeds, the mud sucking at my feet with every step. Behind me I heard crashing, thrashing in the brush where I'd entered the water. The growling thing was following, and ahead of me, in the direction of the howling stink, I could hear movement too, splashing, something heavy wading through the shallows. They were still closing in, even in the water. Fear lent me strength I didn't know I had. I pushed forward, wading deeper, the water up to my chin now, the cold numbing my skin, my teeth starting to chatter. I kept my rifle held high above the water, one hand clutching it, the other paddling, trying to keep my balance, trying to move, trying to escape. The growling behind me was closer now. I could hear the branches snapping, the heavy footfalls in the mud. It was right on the edge of the water, just behind the thick wall of reeds. And from ahead, the howling stink was getting stronger, closer, the splashing growing louder. It was wading into the water, coming for me. I had to go deeper, further into the swamp, get away from the edges, get into the open water. Anything was better than being caught between those two things in the shallows. I plunged forward again, going deeper, swimming now, kicking with my boots, rifle still held high, fighting against the cold, the mud, the darkness, pushing into the heart of the swamp. The water was deeper here, over my head in places. I had to swim, kicking hard, struggling to stay afloat, my clothes heavy and waterlogged, pulling me down. I swam like hell, pushing myself, ignoring the cold, ignoring the fear, just focusing on moving, on getting away. Behind me, the splashing and crashing seemed to fade, become more distant. Ahead, the howling and the stink. They were still there, but they didn't seem to be getting any closer. Maybe I was losing them. I kept swimming for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, pushing deeper and deeper into the swamp, until finally I stumbled into shallower water, my feet hitting solid mud again. I was exhausted, shivering uncontrollably, my teeth chattering like castanets, every muscle in my body aching. I dragged myself out of the water onto a small patch of higher ground, a muddy hummock covered in reeds. I collapsed there, gasping for breath, the cold biting into me, but I was out of the water, out of the deeper part of the swamp, at least for now. I lay there for a long time, huddled on the hummock, shivering, listening. The swamp sounds had come back again, the frogs, the insects, even a few birds chirping tentatively in the distance, but the growling, the howling, the stench, they were gone, silent. Or maybe just further away, lost in the vastness of the swamp. Slowly, cautiously, I started to move again. I was soaked to the bone, freezing, exhausted, but I was alive. I had to get back to my truck. I had to get out of the swamp. I orienteered the rest of the way by the moon, breaking through the clouds now and then, casting a pale, ghostly light across the swamp. I stumbled through the water, the mud, the trees, following the vague sense of direction I had left with, hoping I was going the right way, praying I wouldn't run into them again. It was hours, it felt like, before I finally saw it, the faint glow of my truck in the distance, parked at the edge of the swamp where I'd left it. The sight of it was like seeing a light at the end of a tunnel, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I stumbled towards it, exhaustion pulling at me, relief flooding through me, weakening my knees. I reached the truck, fumbled for my keys, unlocked the door, and practically collapsed into the driver's seat, shaking, shivering, utterly drained. I started the engine, blasted the heat, and just sat there for a minute, letting the warm air wash over me, trying to get my breath back, trying to stop shaking. I was safe. I was out. It was over. Or so I thought. Before I put the truck in gear, I glanced at the hood, just a quick unconscious look, and that's when I saw it. There on the hood of my truck, right in the middle, was a print. Not a paw print, not a footprint. Something else. Big, grotesque, oily looking in the moonlight. 3 thick, elongated digits splayed out, ending in something that looked like claws, maybe? And in the center of the print, a deep impression, like it had been made by something heavy, something solid, something wrong. It wasn't mud, it wasn't dirt, it was greasy, almost black, and it glistened in the moonlight. It looked like it had been burned into the paint, like acid had etched it there. And it stank. The same putrid, sickening stench I'd smelled in the swamp, clinging to the print, lingering in the air around the truck. I stared at it, frozen, the relief draining away, replaced by a fresh wave of cold dread. It had been there. Whatever it was, it had been there, right on my truck. Waiting, watching, I don't know. I didn't touch it. I didn't wipe it off. I just stared at it for a long, silent moment, my blood running cold again. my heart starting to pound once more. Then, slowly, deliberately, I put the truck in gear, put it in drive, and I drove. I drove as fast as I could without looking back, without stopping, until I was out of Backwater Swamp, until I was back on the highway, heading for home, leaving that place and that thing behind me. I haven't been back to Backwater Swamp since, not once, and I don't plan on ever going back. I sold that truck a few months later. Couldn't stand to look at that hood anymore. The print faded a bit with time and washing, but I could still see it, ghosted on the paint, a constant reminder. Sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still hear those sounds in my head. The growl, the howl, the crashing in the brush. And I smell that stench. Wet fur, chemicals, something rotten. And I see that print, burned into the hood of my truck. 3 thick digits and that deep central impression. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. Some things are better left buried in the dark places of the world. And Backwater Swamp, that's definitely one of those places. I just got too close that day. Too damn close. Story 15. Okay, so this is still pretty raw for me to talk about, even after all these years. It happened back in 2005. Fall, I think it was late October, something like that. We were living in Southern California, and my husband, Ricardo, he's always been into hunting. Not like trophy hunting or anything, but just getting out there, you know, feeling connected to nature, bringing home some meat for the freezer. It was supposed to be a father-daughter trip, really. Sophia, our youngest, she was maybe 8, something around there, and she was finally old enough to come with us. She was so excited to go camping and see the stars and, yeah, maybe see some deer. We decided on Forest Ranch up in Northern California. Ricardo had a buddy who said it was a good spot. Lots of public land managed by Diamond Match Company, or used to be anyway. We drove up in our old GMC Jimmy Blazer, that boxy thing from the 90s. Remember those? Reliable as hell, but not exactly quiet. We packed it up with all our camping gear, sleeping bags, rifles, Ricardo's bow, snacks for Sophia that seemed to vanish the second we bought them, the whole shebang. We got there late afternoon, maybe just as the sun was starting to go down. It was already getting chilly, that crisp autumn air. We found the designated hunting area, parked the Jimmy off this dirt road, kind of tucked into some trees. It was dark. Like dark, dark. No moon that night, just stars if you looked up. We ate some sandwiches in the car. I remember Sophia spilled juice all over her pants, and Ricardo got the sleeping bags all laid out in the back. He and Sophia were going to bunk in the back seats, folded down flat, and I was just going to try and get some sleep in the front seat. Not ideal, but hey, it was one night. I remember feeling tired. Not just physically tired from the drive, but a bone-deep kind of tired. The kind where you just want to shut the world out. Ricardo and Sophia were chattering quietly in the back, Ricardo pointing out constellations through the window, Sophia giggling at something. It was nice, peaceful. I reclined my seat as far back as it would go, put my jacket over me, and tried to drift off. It couldn't have been more than an hour later. I was in that half-sleep place, you know, where you're not really asleep but not really awake either, just kind of floating. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer walking through the woods, but these were different, too heavy, too deliberate. Not like an animal rustling in the underbrush, but like someone, something, walking. My heart started to pick up pace. I listened harder. Yeah, footsteps, crunching leaves, snapping twigs, coming closer, slowly, methodically. They were definitely heading towards the Jimmy. Fear, real honest-to-God fear, just slammed into me. I sat bolt upright in my seat, my eyes wide open, straining to hear, to see anything in the blackness outside the windows. The footsteps kept coming. Closer, closer, closer. It wasn't like running or rushing. It was a steady, measured pace. Like whatever it wasn't in a hurry. "Ricardo," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Ricardo, wake up!" He grumbled a bit in the back, mumbled something I couldn't understand. "Ricardo, seriously, wake up. There's something out there." I was starting to panic. My breath was coming fast and shallow. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, clearly annoyed. "What? Elena, what's wrong? Is it a bear? Did you hear a bear?" He was groggy, not taking me seriously at all. "No, I don't think it's a bear," I hissed, keeping my voice low but urgent. "It's footsteps. Human footsteps, but I don't know, just listen." I held my breath, listening, and that's when Ricardo heard it too. The crunch, crunch, crunch of something heavy walking on the leaves just outside the car. His eyes went wide. Sophia, thank God, was still asleep, or pretending to be, curled up in her sleeping bag. Ricardo's face went from sleepy to alert in a split second. He was instantly on edge, his body tense. He leaned forward, his head tilted, listening intently. The footsteps were getting closer, circling the Jimmy now, going around the front, then the side. They were close. Too close. "Okay," Ricardo breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "Okay, yeah, I hear it. What the hell is that?" He started to reach for the door handle, like he was going to jump out and see. "Ricardo, no, don't open the door. What are you doing?" I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard I could feel it in my ears. "I want to see what it is," he said, but his voice wasn't as confident as it usually was. He was scared too, I could tell. "No, just stay in the car. We don't know what it is." My voice was louder now, fear overriding everything. Just stay quiet." We both froze, sitting completely still, hardly even breathing, listening to whatever was circling us in the darkness. The footsteps continued their slow, deliberate patrol around the Jimmy. It felt like it was taking forever. Each crunch of leaves was like a hammer blow to my nerves. I wanted to scream, to yell, to do anything to break the silence, but I was paralyzed by fear. The footsteps stopped, right by my door. I could practically feel something standing there, right outside the thin metal of the car door. My skin crawled. I didn't dare to even look in the side mirror. I just stared straight ahead, my hands clenched so tight in my lap that my knuckles were white. Silence. A thick, heavy silence, broken only by the frantic thumping of my heart. It felt like it lasted an eternity. Then slowly, agonizingly slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away, going around the back of the car, then around the other side, then back to the front, circling us again, like we were trapped, surrounded. I peeked a glance at Ricardo. His face was pale in the faint light filtering in from the dashboard. His eyes were wide, fixed on the passenger window, following the sounds. Sophia was still pretending to be asleep, but I could see her eyes squeeze shut under her eyelids, her breathing shallow and fast. She was awake. She was terrified too. The footsteps stopped again, this time by Ricardo's door. Another agonizing silence. Then they started moving away again, but this time not circling, going straight, away from the car, into the woods, towards the northeast, like I remember. We listened, straining to hear them fade away into the darkness. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Fainter, fainter. Then nothing. Just the silence of the forest again. But it was a different silence now, a silence filled with dread. We sat there, not moving, not speaking, for what felt like ages, waiting, holding our breath, afraid to even blink, afraid it would come back, afraid of what it was, afraid of the silence itself. And then it happened. Maybe a minute, maybe less, after the footsteps faded away completely. The scream. It ripped through the night, a sound that I will never ever forget. It wasn't human. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard. It was guttural, raw, agonized, like pure, unfiltered pain being ripped from the depths of something's soul. It started low, a deep, rumbling growl that quickly escalated into a piercing, high-pitched scream. It was loud, unbelievably loud. It felt like it vibrated through the air, through the car, through our bones. It was so intense, so visceral, it felt physically painful to listen to. The scream went on, prolonged, drawn out, agonizing. It wasn't just loud, it was filled with such unbelievable suffering, such pure terror, that it was contagious. Fear that I thought I had already reached the limit of doubled, tripled. It burrowed into my brain, into my heart, twisting something inside me. I felt cold, clammy, nauseous. I squeezed my eyes shut, clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound still pierced through, echoing in my skull. I could feel Ricardo shaking beside me. I dared to open my eyes and look at him. His face was ashen, his eyes were wide, staring straight ahead, but not seeing anything in the car. He was staring into the darkness, into the source of that horrifying sound. Sophia, I could hear her whimpering softly in the back. The scream finally stopped, just as abruptly as it started. Silence again, but this time it was even heavier, even more oppressive than before. The silence after the scream was thick with something indescribable. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting, expecting something worse to happen. We didn't move. We didn't speak. We just sat there, frozen in terror, trapped in the suffocating silence after that unearthly scream. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we had just heard, what we had just experienced. But there was no sense to be made. It was beyond understanding, beyond explanation. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but I was completely paralyzed. The fear had burrowed so deep, it had turned me to stone. All I could do was sit there, shaking, listening to the frantic pounding of my own heart, waiting for... I didn't even know what I was waiting for. Maybe for it to come back, maybe for the sun to rise, maybe for it all to just be a nightmare. We stayed like that for hours, it felt like. Hours of agonizing silence, punctuated by the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl that sounded almost comforting in comparison to what we had just heard. We didn't dare to speak, didn't dare to move, afraid that any sound, any movement would draw whatever had made that scream back to us. Finally, slowly, achingly slowly, the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, a faint, barely perceptible grayness that gradually chased away the absolute blackness of the night. As the light grew stronger, something shifted. The crushing weight of the fear started to ease, just a tiny bit, enough for me to finally take a deep breath, a shaky, rattling breath, but a breath nonetheless. Ricardo moved first. He turned to me, his eyes bloodshot, his face still pale, but some of the color was starting to return. "Elena," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Did you hear that?" Like he needed to ask. Like we could possibly have experienced the same thing and he still needed to ask. But I knew what he meant. He needed confirmation. He needed to know he hadn't just imagined it. I nodded, unable to speak. Tears welled up in my eyes, hot tears of relief and lingering terror. Sophia in the back started to cry, real sobs now. Ricardo turned to her, reached back and touched her arm gently. "Sophia, honey, it's okay now. It's almost morning." But it wasn't okay. It wouldn't be okay for a long time. As soon as it was light enough to see, Ricardo started the Jimmy. He didn't say a word. He just put it in drive and started driving, fast, bumping and bouncing over the dirt road, back towards the paved road, away from that place. We didn't pack up anything. We just left everything behind. The camping gear, the hunting equipment, everything. We just wanted to get the hell out of there. We drove all the way home in silence. Sophia eventually fell asleep in the back, exhausted from the night of terror. Ricardo and I didn't speak. What was there to say? We had shared something horrific, something we couldn't explain, something that changed us both in ways I'm still trying to understand. We never went back to Forest Ranch. Ricardo never hunted in that area again. We never talked about it much, not really. It's like it was too awful, too unreal to put into words. Even now, all these years later, when I think about it, I can still hear that scream in my head. And I still have no idea what made it. What was out there that night, circling our car in the darkness, before letting out that sound of pure, unimaginable agony? I honestly don't want to know. Some things are better left in the dark, buried in the silence of a night in the woods. And some nights change you forever.